My sister's wealthy in-laws thought they were looking at just another struggling veteran when I walked into their upscale country club alone, wearing my simple dress uniform. What they didn't know was that the poor military sister they'd been mocking for months was actually the anonymous founder of the tech company that had just acquired their family's failing business empire. The afternoon sun filtered through the towering oak trees lining Pinehurst Country Club's circular driveway as Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez adjusted her dress blue uniform one final time. At 29, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from leading soldiers through 2 deployments in Iraq, but today felt different. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Today, she was walking into enemy territory of a different kind. The country club sat like a monument to old money in the heart of Westchester County, its ivy-covered brick walls and perfectly manicured grounds, speaking of generations of privilege. Elena had never set foot in a place like this before, despite the fact that her younger sister Maria had been married into the prestigious Blackwell family for over a year now. Elena checked her watch. She was deliberately arriving late to Maria's baby shower, knowing that most of the formal presentations would be over and the atmosphere would be more relaxed, or so she hoped. The truth was, she'd been dreading this moment for months. Every family gathering Maria described painted the same picture: the Blackwell family's barely concealed disdain for Maria's humble background and their particular distaste for her charity case. Military sister. The invitation had been begrudging at best. Maria had practically begged her mother-in-law, Patricia Blackwell, to include Elena in the celebration. "She's family now," Maria had pleaded during their last phone call, "and she's finally back from overseas." Patricia's response, according to Maria, had been a cold, "I suppose we can accommodate one more, though I do hope she understands the dress code." Elena's dress uniform was immaculate, every ribbon precisely placed, her combat boots polished to a mirror shine, her beret positioned at the exact regulation angle. She'd earned every decoration on her chest through blood, sweat, and sacrifice, in places most people couldn't pronounce. But she knew that to the Blackwells, she would simply look like what Patricia had once called her, Maria's little project. The thing was, the Blackwells had no idea who they were really dealing with. For the past 3 years while serving her country, Elena had also been quietly building something extraordinary. Using her military communications background and the coding skills she'd developed during late nights in forward operating bases, she'd created a revolutionary cybersecurity platform that had caught the attention of major corporations worldwide. Her company, Phoenix Digital Solutions, operated completely under her legal name, Rodriguez, and had grown from a one-woman operation to a multi-million-dollar enterprise with government contracts and fortune. The irony wasn't lost on her that Phoenix Digital had recently acquired several struggling companies, including Blackwell Industries, the family's century-old textile business that had been hemorrhaging money for the past 5 years. The Blackwells had no idea that their mysterious new corporate overlord was currently walking up their country club steps. Elena had kept her business success private for good reason. Military regulations required careful disclosure of outside business interests, and she'd wanted to focus on her service without the distraction of media attention. Only Maria knew the truth, and Elena had sworn her to secrecy. "Let me finish my service commitment first," she'd told her sister. "Then we'll figure out how to handle the family dynamics." But those family dynamics had become increasingly toxic. Through Maria's tearful phone calls, Elena had learned about the constant subtle jabs at their family's background. How Patricia would introduce Maria as "our son's wife." What was it, dear? That little town in New Mexico. How Robert Blackwell, the family patriarch, would pontificate about people who understand the value of hard work while pointedly looking at Maria during family dinner. How they'd suggested that Elena's military service was just a phase before she'd need to find real employment. The breaking point had come 2 weeks ago when Maria called, sobbing, after a particularly brutal family dinner. Patricia had loudly wondered whether military families could really provide proper guidance for raising children, given their unstable lifestyle and limited worldview. Robert had nodded sagely and added that it was fortunate their grandchild would grow up with proper advantages and connections, unlike some people. Elena had listened to her sister cry and made a decision. It was time for the Blackwells to learn exactly who they'd been looking down upon. She pushed through the heavy mahogany doors of the country club's main entrance, immediately struck by the overwhelming display of wealth. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings, oil paintings of long-dead robber barons lined the walls, and the subtle scent of expensive cigars and older money permeated the air. Members in tennis whites and golf attire moved through the lobby with the casual entitlement that came from never having to worry about their next meal. The young hostess at the reception desk looked up with a practiced smile that faltered slightly when she saw Elena's uniform. "May I help?" she asked, her tone polite but cool. "I'm here for the Blackwell baby shower," Elena replied calmly. "Elena Rodriguez." The hostess consulted her tablet, scrolling longer than necessary. "Oh yes. Here you are, you're Maria's sister." The question carried a subtle note of surprise, as if she couldn't quite reconcile Elena's appearance with whatever she'd been told to expect. "That's correct. The event is in the garden room. Follow the hallway to the left, past the library." She gestured vaguely, already turning her attention to the next arriving guest, an elderly woman dripping in pearls, who clearly required no explanation of her presence. Elena made her way through the club's labyrinthine hallways, passing photographs of decades of club champions and society events. She could hear the gentle murmur of conversation and laughter growing louder as she approached the garden room, along with the delicate clink of crystal glasses and silver cutlery. She paused at the doorway, taking in the scene before her. The room was spectacular. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked perfectly manicured gardens. Round tables draped in pristine white linens held elaborate floral centerpieces, and about 30 women in designer dresses chatted over champagne and canapés that probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery. At the center of it all sat Maria, glowing in a pale blue maternity dress, opening gifts with practiced grace, while Patricia Blackwell held court nearby, clearly reveling in her role as the gracious hostess. Elena recognized several faces from Maria's wedding photos, the cream of Westchester County society, all perfectly coiffed and impeccably dressed. Elena took a deep breath and stepped into the room. The change was immediate and unmistakable. Conversations didn't exactly stop, but they shifted, becoming more hushed. Eyes tracked her movement across the room with the kind of subtle attention that wealthy people had perfected, appearing not to stare while missing absolutely nothing. She could practically hear their thoughts. Who invited the soldier? How awkward for Maria. Doesn't she know this isn't a military function? Patricia Blackwell's smile became so tight it looked painful as Elena approached. "Elena," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quieter room. "How unexpected. We weren't sure you'd make it." "I wouldn't miss my sister's celebration," Elena replied evenly, leaning down to kiss Maria's cheek. Her sister's eyes were bright with a mixture of joy and apprehension. "Elena," Maria exclaimed, gripping her hand tight. "I'm so glad you're here. How was your flight from Colorado?" Before Elena could answer, Patricia's voice cut through again, louder than necessary. "Yes, Elena's been stationed at, where was it again? One of those western bases." She said it with the same tone most people might use to describe a particularly unpleasant medical procedure. The women at nearby tables were listening now, not even pretending to continue their own conversation. Elena recognized the look. It was the same expression she'd seen in briefing rooms when someone was about to be made an example of. "Fort Carson," Elena said simply. "Colorado Springs." "How nice," Patricia replied, though her tone suggested it was anything but. "And what will you do now that you're between assignments?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Elena was very aware that every ear in the room was tuned to this conversation, waiting to see how the out-of-place soldier would handle being put in her place by Westchester County royalty. Elena smiled, the same calm, confident smile she'd worn while briefing General. "Actually," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the garden room, "I have a meeting here this afternoon. Business." Patricia's eyebrows rose in what might have been amusement or disdain. "Business? Here at the club?" "That's right. With Robert Blackwell, actually. About Phoenix Digital Solutions." For the first time since Elena had entered the room, Patricia Blackwell looked genuinely surprised. The silence that followed Elena's mention of Phoenix Digital Solutions stretched for exactly 3 heartbeats before Patricia Blackwell's laugh rang out across the garden room. It was the kind of laugh wealthy women had perfected over generations, musical, dismissive, and sharp enough to cut glass. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Phoenix Digital, Patricia repeated, loud enough for the entire room to hear. Oh my dear, I think there's been some confusion. That's a very important technology company. They recently acquired several businesses, including some of Robert's holdings. She turned to the women at the nearest table with an indulgent smile. Isn't it sweet? She must have gotten the names mixed up. The society ladies tittered appreciatively, like a Greek chorus of designer-clad judgment. Elena could see Maria's face flushing red with embarrassment and anger, her sister's hands clenched tightly in her lap. Miss Catherine Pemberton, a rail-thin woman whose family had owned half of Westchester County since the 1800s, leaned forward with predatory interest. Patricia, dear, didn't you mention that this Phoenix company was run by some mysterious tech mogul? Very hush-hush, very exclusive. Oh yes, Patricia nodded enthusiastically, clearly relishing the opportunity to demonstrate her insider knowledge. Robert's been dealing with their representatives for months. Very impressive operation. The founder is supposedly some brilliant entrepreneur, Harvard or MIT background, I believe, quite successful. She glanced at Elena with barely concealed amusement. I'm sure it's an honest mistake, dear. Perhaps you heard the name somewhere. And Elena remained perfectly still, her military training keeping her expression neutral even as she felt the familiar surge of controlled anger that had gotten her through hostile territories and incompetent commanding officer. She'd faced down insurgents and navigated Pentagon politics, but there was something uniquely infuriating about watching privileged people mock her family while demonstrating their complete ignorance. Actually, Elena said quietly, her voice carrying the same controlled tone she'd used when addressing hostile village elders in Anbar province. There's no confusion. I have a 3:30 appointment with Mr. Blackwell to discuss the acquisition term. Margaret Ashworth, whose husband ran the largest law firm in the county, nearly choked on her champagne. Acquisition terms? My dear girl, I think you misunderstand how business works. Phoenix Digital doesn't take meetings. She gestured vaguely at Elena's uniform. Well, with people who don't move in those circles. The insult hung in the air like smoke from expensive cigar. Elena could see Maria starting to stand, her sister's protective instincts finally overriding her desire to keep the peace. But Elena caught her eye and gave the slightest shake of her head. Patricia, emboldened by her audience's reaction, decided to drive the point home. Elena, sweetheart, I appreciate that you want to help your sister, but these are very serious business matters. Phoenix Digital is run by real entrepreneurs, people with advanced degrees from top universities, people who understand global markets and complex financial structure. Her voice took on the patronizing tone of someone explaining simple concepts to a slow child. It's not the sort of thing you learn in the military, I'm afraid. Mother, please, Maria said quietly, but Patricia was just getting started. Oh, I don't mean any offense, dear, Patricia continued, her voice growing louder as she played to her audience. Military service is very admirable, I'm sure, but let's be realistic about career prospects. What could a soldier possibly offer a company like Phoenix Digital? They deal with Fortune 500 corporations, government contracts, cutting-edge technology. She paused dramatically. I mean, what would you even put on a resume? Can follow orders, good with guns. The women around the table laughed again, more boldly now. Elena noticed how they looked at her, not with malice exactly, but with the kind of dismissive pity wealthy people reserved for those they considered fundamentally beneath their station. Mrs. Pemberton leaned back in her chair with obvious satisfaction. Patricia's absolutely right, of course. Robert's been so impressed with Phoenix Digital's sophistication. Their legal team alone must have cost more than most people make in a year. The founder apparently insisted on keeping their identity private. Very successful people often do, you know. Too much attention. She glanced meaningfully at Elena. Well, from people who wouldn't understand. Elena felt her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. These women had no idea they were discussing her legal team, her insistence on privacy, her acquisition of their husband's failing company. She thought about the sleepless nights she'd spent in Iraq, coding by the light of her laptop while listening for incoming mortars, building the algorithms that now powered their very impressive operation. She thought about the government contracts she'd won by being better, smarter and more innovative than her Ivy League-educated competitors. The meetings actually about finalizing some details from the Blackwell Industries acquisition. Elena said calmly, "There are some operational changes that need to be discussed." This time, Patricia's laugh had an edge to it. "Oh honey, no. Just, no. Robert handles all the business affairs. He's been working on this Phoenix digital situation for months. It's incredibly complex, incredibly sophisticated. They're restructuring the entire textile division, implementing new technologies, completely modernizing operations that have been in our family for generations." She turned to address the room. "It's actually quite fascinating. This Phoenix founder has completely revolutionized how these old industrial companies operate. Very forward-thinking, very innovative." Margaret Ashworth nodded sagely. "My husband's been following their expansion. Apparently they specialize in taking struggling traditional businesses and transforming them with cutting-edge digital solutions." Brilliant strategy, really. The founder must have an extraordinary background to understand both technology and traditional manufacturing. "Extraordinary indeed," Mrs. Pemberton agreed. "Robert mentioned they have contracts with the Defense Department. Very exclusive, very high-level security clearances required, not the sort of thing just anyone could manage." Elena almost smiled at that. Her security clearance was so high that most of the people in this room couldn't even be told what classification level it was. Patricia stood up, clearly deciding to end this embarrassing conversation before Elena could further embarrass herself. "You know what, dear? Why don't we find you a nice seat, get you some refreshments, and let you enjoy Maria's shower? I'm sure you must be tired from your travels." Her tone was gentle but firm, the way someone might speak to a confused elderly relative at a family gathering. "And perhaps," she added with an indulgent smile that didn't reach her eyes, "we can arrange for you to meet some people who might help with your job search. I know several families who are looking for security personnel or personal assistants. Nothing too demanding, of course, but it might be a good way to transition back to civilian life." The offer was delivered with such practiced condescension that Elena almost admired its artistry. Here was a woman who had just suggested hiring her as domestic help while simultaneously explaining why she could never understand the business that Elena had built from nothing in forward operating bases and late-night coding sessions. Maria's face had gone white with fury, her hands actually shaking as she gripped her napkin. Several other guests looked uncomfortable now, perhaps sensing that Patricia was going too far, but the core group of society matriarchs seemed to be enjoying the show. Elena checked her watch. In 5 minutes, she was scheduled to meet with Robert Blackwell in the club's Oak Room to discuss the future of his family's company. In 5 minutes, everything these women thought they knew about power, success, and who belonged in their world was about to change. But first, she had something to say. "That's very kind of you," Elena replied, her voice still calm and controlled. "But I think you might be surprised by how this afternoon unfolds." Patricia's smile became razor thin. "Oh, I doubt that very much, dear. I really do." The tension in the garden room had shifted from amused condescension to something sharper, more uncomfortable. Elena could see it in the way some of the guests were now looking anywhere but at the confrontation unfolding before them, while others leaned forward with the hungry anticipation of spectators at a gladiatorial match. Patricia Blackwell, however, was just getting warmed up. The appearance of confidence that came from decades of social dominance had taken over, and she clearly viewed Elena's quiet persistence as a challenge to the natural order of things. In Patricia's world, people like Elena were supposed to know their place and stay in it. "You know what I find so interesting about military families?" Patricia announced to the room, her voice carrying the theatrical quality of someone delivering a well-rehearsed performance. "They always seem to think that service entitles them to, well, to things they haven't actually earned." Mrs. Pemberton nodded knowingly. "Oh yes, that sense of entitlement is quite common. They expect special treatment just because they chose to enlist." Elena felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd heard this before, the casual dismissal of military sacrifice by people who had never missed a single comfortable night's sleep while others stood watch. But when it was directed at her family, at Maria, who was sitting right there with tears of humiliation beginning to form in her eyes, it hit differently. "Now don't misunderstand me," Patricia continued, warming to her theme. "We're very grateful for military service, of course. It's just that gratitude doesn't translate to business qualifications or social position. There's a reason certain families have maintained their standing for generations. It's about education, connections, understanding how the world actually works." Margaret Ashworth jumped in eagerly. "Exactly. My daughter did her MBA at Wharton, and even she found the Phoenix digital acquisition fascinating from a strategic perspective. The level of sophistication required to orchestrate something like that." She shook her head in admiration. "It's simply not something you could learn from a military manual." Elena watched Maria's face crumple slightly, and felt her own controlled anger begin to shift into something more dangerous. These women weren't just insulting her, they were systematically dismantling her sister's dignity in front of an audience of the people Maria would have to face at every future family gathering. "The thing is," Patricia said, turning back to Elena with renewed confidence, "Maria is family now. She's a Blackwell, and while we've been very understanding about her background, there comes a time when we have to think about what's best for the baby." The room went completely silent. Elena felt her military training kick in, the hyper-awareness that came before combat situation. Every detail became crystal clear. The way Patricia's hands were clasped in front of her like a principal about to deliver bad news, the way Maria had gone completely still, the predatory interest in Mrs. Pemberton's eyes. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Elena asked, her voice quiet but carrying clearly across the room. Patricia's smile was practiced and cold. "Well, children need stability, proper influences, appropriate role models. We can't have them thinking that certain lifestyle choices are normal or desirable." "Mother," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper, but Patricia wasn't done. "I mean, what kind of example does it set? A woman in her 30s, who's never held a real job, never built anything meaningful, never contributed to society in any substantial way. Children are so impressionable, and we simply can't have them thinking that running around playing soldier is an acceptable career path." Elena's hands, which had been resting calmly at her sides, slowly curled into fit. Patricia had just crossed into territory that was sacred, not just insulting Elena's service, but doing it in a way that would poison her future relationship with her sister's child. Mrs. Pemberton, sensing blood in the water, decided to pile on. "Patricia's absolutely right. Children need to understand the value of real achievement, real contribution to society, not just following orders and collecting government paychecks. And let's be honest," Patricia continued, her voice rising slightly with the confidence of someone who believes they're delivering a crushing blow, "what has military service ever really accomplished for people like Elena? No real skills, no business experience, no connections worth mentioning. It's essentially a welfare program for people who can't make it in the real world." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Elena could feel every eye in the room on her, waiting to see how she would react to having her 8 years of service, her 2 combat deployments, her sacrifices, and those of every soldier she'd ever served with, dismissed as welfare fraud. But Patricia wasn't she was clearly enjoying herself now, playing to an audience that was hanging on every word. "I think what concerns us most," she said, her tone shifting to one of mock concern, "is the influence this might have on our grandchild. Children need to see examples of real success, real accomplishment. They need to understand that in America, success comes from hard work, education, and building something meaningful, not from government handouts and participation trophies." Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a cold fury that was different from anything she'd experienced in combat zones. In Iraq, at least the enemy had the decency to shoot at you direct. Take Phoenix Digital for example, Patricia continued, clearly oblivious to the danger she was walking into. "That's real achievement. That's the kind of success story our grandchild should aspire to. Someone who built something from nothing, who understood technology and business and global markets, not someone who spent their 20s playing dress-up and pretending to be important. Maria stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Stop," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "Just stop talking." But Patricia was beyond stopping. She was in full performance mode now, delivering what she clearly believed was the coup de grace. "Oh, Maria darling, I know this is difficult, but someone has to say it. Your sister is nearly 30 years old and has never accomplished anything meaningful in her life. She has no real education, no real skills, no real prospects, and now she's walking around making ridiculous claims about important business meetings." Patricia laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. "It's embarrassing, dear, for all of us." She turned back to Elena, her eyes glittering with the satisfaction of someone who believes they've just delivered a fatal blow. "I mean, really, Elena, did you honestly think you could walk into our world and pretend to be something you're not? Did you think we wouldn't see through such an obvious fabrication? You're a soldier, dear, nothing more, nothing less, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just important to know your place." Elena looked at her sister, saw the tears streaming down Maria's face, saw the humiliation and rage and helplessness in her eyes. She thought about all the phone calls where Maria had cried about these people, all the subtle cruelties and casual dismissals that had been building for months. She thought about the soldiers she'd served with, who had died protecting the freedom of people like Patricia to live their comfortable, protected lives. She thought about the late nights in Iraq when she'd been building the company that had just saved Robert Blackwell's failing business empire while Patricia slept safely in her mansion. And she thought about her unborn nephew, or niece, who would grow up hearing these same attitudes, these same casual dismissals of service and sacrifice. Elena checked her watch, 3:29 p.m. "You know what, Patricia?" Elena said quietly, her voice carrying the same controlled tone she'd used when calling in artillery strikes. "You're absolutely right about one thing." Patricia smiled triumphantly. "Oh? It is important to know your place," Elena replied. "And in about 30 seconds, you're going to learn exactly what yours is." The garden room fell completely silent as Elena turned and walked toward the door. Behind her, she could hear Patricia's nervous laugh and the uncertain murmur of voices trying to process what had just happened. Elena paused at the doorway and looked back at the room full of society women who had just spent 20 minutes systematically destroying her sister's dignity. "Ladies," she said calmly, "you might want to follow me to the Oak Room. I have a feeling this meeting is going to be very educational." The Oak Room of Pinehurst Country Club was everything the garden room wasn't. Dark mahogany paneling, leather-bound books lining floor-to-ceiling shelves, and the lingering scent of expensive tobacco and old money. It was the kind of room where generations of powerful men had made deals that shaped industries and decided the fate of entire communities. Robert Blackwell stood at the massive windows overlooking the golf course, his silver hair perfectly styled, his navy blazer bearing the subtle hallmarks of Savile Row tailoring. At 65, he carried himself with the confident bearing of a man who had never doubted his place in the world's hierarchy. Behind him, two men in expensive suits flanked a polished conference table covered with legal documents. "Mr. Whitmore," Robert was saying to the taller of the two men, "I have to admit, your client's terms are more generous than I expected. Phoenix Digital could have driven a much harder bargain, given our circumstances." James Whitmore, senior partner at Manhattan's most prestigious corporate law firm, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. "The founder believes in preserving the legacy of American manufacturing, Mr. Blackwell. The restructuring plan maintains most of your workforce while modernizing operations. It's quite elegant, actually." The second man, David Chen from Phoenix Digital's executive team, nodded agreement. "Our CEO specifically requested that we prioritize employee retention and community impact. The Blackwell Industries acquisition isn't just about profit margins." Robert smiled, though Elena could see the strain around his eyes. Selling the family business, even to save it, clearly wasn't easy for a man whose great-grandfather had founded the company. "I'll be honest, gentlemen," Robert said, turning from the window. "I'm curious to finally meet this mysterious founder of yours. Very few people in business maintain such complete anonymity these days. You're about to get your wish, Elena said quietly from the doorway. All three men turned, their expressions shifting from surprise to confusion. As they took in Elena's military uniform, Robert's eyes narrowed slightly, clearly trying to place why this soldier was interrupting his crucial business meeting. "I'm sorry," Robert said with the polite firmness of someone accustomed to being in charge, "but this is a private meeting. If you're looking for the baby shower, I'm exactly where I need to be, Miss Blackwell," Elena replied, stepping into the room with the measured pace of someone who belonged there. "Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez, United States Army, also known to your legal team as E.R. Rodriguez, founder and CEO of Phoenix Digital Solutions." The silence that followed was so complete that Elena could hear the grandfather clock in the corner ticking away the second. Robert's face went through a remarkable transformation: confusion, disbelief, dawning comprehension, and finally a kind of stunned acceptance that his world had just shifted on its axis. James Whitmore was the first to recover his professional composure. "Sergeant Rodriguez," he said, standing and extending his hand with a slight smile, "it's an honor to finally meet you in person. Your insistence on anonymity has made these negotiations interesting." David Chen grinned broadly. "Ma'am, it's good to see you. Though I have to say, the uniform suits you better than those video conference calls from your base office." Robert Blackwell stood frozen, his mind clearly racing to process what he was hearing. Elena could practically see him connecting the dots. The mysterious tech mogul who had saved his family business was the same Charity Case, military sister his wife had been mocking for over a year. I don't understand," Robert finally managed. You're Elena, Maria's sister. Patricia said you were looking for work, that you needed help transitioning to civilian life." "Your wife has said a lot of things about me," Elena replied calmly. "Most of them in the last 20 minutes. She's quite articulate when it comes to explaining why soldiers like me don't belong in your world." The blood drained from Robert's face as the full implications hit him. Oh God, the baby shower. She didn't. Elena, if Patricia said something inappropriate. Elena's voice remained controlled, but there was steel beneath it. "She spent 20 minutes explaining to a room full of your friends why my military service was essentially welfare fraud, why I was a bad influence on your grandchild, and why I needed to know my place." James Whitmore cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should reschedule." "No," Elena said firmly. "We're finishing this meeting. Mr. Blackwell, you wanted to meet Phoenix Digital's founder. Well, here I am." The soldier with no real education, no real skills, and no real prospects who just spent 3 years building the company that saved your family's century-old business. She moved to the conference table, her bearing shifting subtly from informal to executive. When she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded soldiers in combat and negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts with Fortune 500 companies. "Let's review the terms, shall we? Phoenix Digital has acquired Blackwell Industries for $47 million, which is $12 million more than your company's assessed value. We're retaining 94% of your workforce, maintaining your North Carolina manufacturing facility, and investing an additional $15 million in equipment modernization over the next 2 years." Robert sat down heavily, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Elena, we had no idea." "Of course you didn't, because in your wife's world, people like me don't build companies like this. We don't hold government security clearances that allow us to work on Defense Department contracts. We don't develop cybersecurity platforms that protect critical infrastructure." Elena's voice remained calm, but her words carried the weight of years of being underestimated and dismissed. "In your wife's world," she continued, "soldiers are just people who couldn't make it in the real world. We're welfare recipients playing dress-up, collecting government paychecks because we're too incompetent to build something meaningful." David Chen shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, perhaps we should." "No, David. Miss Blackwell needs to understand exactly who he's been allowing his wife to insult for the past year." Elena turned her attention back to Robert, whose face had gone pale. Every time Patricia made a comment about Maria's unfortunate family background, She was talking about the person who was quietly building the company that would eventually save yours. Every time she wondered aloud whether military families could provide proper guidance for children, she was questioning the judgment of the woman who employs 847 people across 12 states and holds contracts with 3 different federal agencies. Elena paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. And today, when she suggested that your grandchild needed better role models than a soldier who had never accomplished anything meaningful, she was talking about the person who is about to decide the future of your family's legacy. Robert's hands were actually shaking now. Elena, please. Patricia, she doesn't always think before she speaks. If she knew what? Mr. Blackwell, if she knew I was worth $107 million, would that change her opinion of military service? If she knew I held advanced degrees in computer science and business administration, would that make my sister more acceptable to your family? Elena leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to the same controlled tone she'd used when interrogating hostile prisoner. Because here's what she doesn't understand. Every dollar of Phoenix Digital's success was built while I was serving my country. Every breakthrough, every contract, every innovation happened during the years your wife dismissed as playing soldier. I was writing code in forward operating bases while mortars fell outside my tent. I was debugging security protocols between patrol missions in Anbar Province. The room was dead silent, except for the ticking clock and Robert's labored breathing. So when your wife questions whether military families can provide proper guidance for children, Elena concluded, she might want to consider that this particular military family just became your grandchild's financial security for the next several generations. At that moment, the Oak Room's heavy doors opened, and Patricia Blackwell swept in with her entourage of society ladies trailing behind her like expensive satellites. Robert, darling, Patricia called out brightly, apparently unaware of the tension in the room. We thought we'd come see how your important meeting was going. The ladies are so curious about this Phoenix Digital. She stopped mid-sentence as she took in the scene, her husband pale and shaken, 2 lawyers looking deeply uncomfortable, and Elena standing at the head of the conference table like she owned it, which, Elena reflected, she essentially did. Patricia, Robert said weakly, I'd like you to meet Elena Rodriguez, the founder and CEO of Phoenix Digital Solutions. Patricia's smile faltered as her eyes moved from Robert to Elena and back again. I'm sorry, what? Your husband just sold his company to me, Patricia, Elena said calmly. The soldier with no real education, no real skills, and no meaningful accomplishments. I'm your new boss. The grandfather clock in the Oak Room chimed 3:45 p.m., marking exactly 15 minutes since Elena had walked into what Patricia Blackwell had assumed would be a routine humiliation of an unwelcome guest. Now Patricia stood frozen in the doorway like a deer caught in headlights, her brain struggling to process the impossible reality unfolding before her. I'm sorry, what did you just say? Patricia's voice came out as barely a whisper. All her earlier confidence evaporated like morning mist. Elena remained perfectly calm, her military bearing giving her an authority that filled the mahogany-paneled room. I said I'm your new boss, Patricia. Phoenix Digital Solutions now owns Blackwell Industries, which means I own the company that's been supporting your family's lifestyle for the past century. Behind Patricia, the society ladies who had been so eager to witness Elena's humiliation, now shuffled uncomfortably, suddenly finding the Persian carpet and oil paintings fascinating. Mrs. Pemberton's face had gone ashen, while Margaret Ashworth was staring at Elena like she was seeing a ghost. David Chen, Elena's executive team member, stepped forward with professional courtesy. Mrs. Blackwell, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. Your husband has spoken of you often during our negotiations. James Whitmore, the attorney, added with barely concealed satisfaction. Miss Blackwell, your family should be very proud. Miss Rodriguez's acquisition has essentially saved Blackwell Industries from bankruptcy. Without Phoenix Digital's intervention, the company would have been liquidated within 6 months. Patricia's mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. Robert Blackwell slumped deeper into his leather chair, the full weight of his family's situation, and his wife's behavior crushing down on him. Bankruptcy. Mrs. Pemberton squeaked from the door. But Robert, you said business was failing. Elena interrupted smoothly. Blackwell Industries lost $8.7 million last year alone. Orders were down 34%, Their largest client canceled a $12 million contract in February, and they were 3 months behind on equipment loan payment. Without our acquisition, every employee would have been unemployed by Christmas. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena could see Patricia's mind racing, trying to reconcile everything she'd said about the mysterious Phoenix Digital founder with the woman she'd just spent 20 minutes insulting. But Patricia struggled to form words. You're just a soldier. You said yourself. I never said I was just anything, Elena corrected calmly. You did. You decided that military service meant I was uneducated, unemployable, and essentially worthless. You made those assumptions all by yourself. Maria appeared in the doorway behind the other women, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes bright with vindication. She pushed past Mrs. Pemberton and walked straight to Elena's side, taking her sister's hand. Actually, Maria said, her voice stronger than it had been all afternoon, Elena has a master's degree in computer science from MIT and an MBA from Stanford. She completed both while serving active duty. But I suppose Patricia was too busy talking to ask about my sister's education. Margaret Ashworth's face went white. MIT. But earlier I said Phoenix Digital's founder had an impressive educational background, Patricia said faintly. You assumed it couldn't be Elena because she wore a uniform instead of a designer dress, Maria said fiercely. You assumed that serving our country meant she was somehow less than you. Elena squeezed her sister's hand, then turned back to the room with executive precision. Let's discuss the immediate changes to Blackwell Industries operations. Mr. Chen will be implementing new management protocols starting Monday. We're also restructuring the board of directors. Robert looked up with alarm. Restructure? Elena, surely we can work something out. The restructuring is necessary for operational efficiency, Elena replied with corporate formality. However, I'm willing to discuss maintaining some family involvement, depending on certain conditions. Patricia finally found her voice. What kind of conditions? Elena's expression remained professionally neutral, but there was steel in her voice. Let's start with basic respect for Phoenix Digital employees and their families. That includes Maria, who will be taking a position as Director of Community Relations, overseeing our family support programs. Family support programs? Robert asked weakly. We're implementing comprehensive support systems for military families in our workforce, Elena explained. Maria will be managing educational scholarships, family counseling services, and transition assistance programs. It's a $2.3 million annual commitment. The irony was exquisite. Patricia had just spent an hour explaining why military families were unsuitable influences on children, only to discover that her daughter-in-law would now be running programs specifically designed to support those same families. Miss Pemberton, clearly desperate to salvage something from the wreckage of the afternoon, stepped forward with a trembling smile. Elena, dear, I think there may have been some misunderstandings earlier. No misunderstandings, Elena replied coolly. You were quite clear that military service was essentially welfare fraud. You specifically said that soldiers were people who couldn't make it in the real world. That's not exactly what I meant. I have an excellent memory, Mrs. Pemberton. It comes from years of military briefings where accuracy was literally a matter of life and death. Elena's voice carried the same controlled authority she'd used when addressing hostile village elders in Iraq. You also suggested that children needed to see real success rather than participation trophies. Elena gestured to the legal documents spread across the conference table. Well, here's some real success for you to consider. Phoenix Digital's gross revenue last year was, we employ nearly 1,000 people across 12 states. We hold contracts with the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, and 17 Fortune 500 companies. She paused, letting the numbers sink in. Our cybersecurity platform protects 23% of America's critical infrastructure, including the power grid that keeps the lights on in your mansion. Mrs. Pemberton. Margaret Ashworth tried to speak, but Elena wasn't finished. And since you were so concerned about proper influences on children, you might be interested to know that Phoenix Digital's charitable foundation, has provided $34 million in educational scholarships over the past 3 years, primarily to military families and underprivileged communities. The room was dead silent except for the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock. Patricia swayed slightly, gripping the back of a chair for support. "Elena," Robert said desperately, "please understand, Patricia didn't know. She didn't know because she didn't ask," Elena replied. "She made assumptions based on prejudice and ignorance, the same prejudice that made her suggest I was a bad influence on your grandchild." Elena's voice softened slightly, but lost none of its authority. "Speaking of your grandchild, I've decided to establish a $10 million education trust fund. The interest alone will ensure they can attend any university in the world, pursue any career they choose, and never have to worry about financial security." Patricia's legs seemed to give out, and she sank into the nearest chair. $10 million. Consider it an investment in family harmony, Elena said. "After all, I want my nephew or niece to grow up understanding that success comes in many forms, including the form of people who serve their country with honor." Maria squeezed Elena's hand tighter, tears streaming down her face, but these were tears of pride, not humiliation. Elena checked her watch. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a conference call with the Pentagon in 20 minutes. Something about expanding our defense contract." She gathered her papers with military precision. "David, please ensure the Blackwells receive copies of all restructuring documents by tomorrow morning." She paused at the doorway and looked back at Patricia, who was still slumped in her chair, the picture of shocked defeat. "Oh, and Patricia, next time you want to discuss someone's qualifications or character, you might want to do your research first. It would save everyone a lot of embarrassment." As Elena walked out of the oak room with Maria beside her, she could hear the stunned silence behind them finally breaking into urgent whispers and confused questions. The afternoon sun was still shining through the country club's windows, but for the Blackwell family and their social circle, the world had shifted permanently on its axis. Patricia Blackwell, who had awakened that morning as the undisputed queen of Westchester County society, now sat in ruin, knowing that her family's financial future and her grandchild's inheritance depended entirely on the grace of the woman she had just spent an hour systematically insulting. It was, Elena reflected, a very educational afternoon indeed. 3 months later, the transformation was complete. The executive conference room on the 32nd floor of Phoenix Digital's Manhattan headquarters buzzed with quiet efficiency as Elena Rodriguez reviewed the quarterly reports spread across the polished table. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Hudson River sparkled in the afternoon sun, and the distant Statue of Liberty stood as a silent reminder of the values that had built both her company and her character. "Blackwell Industries is exceeding all projections," David Chen reported, sliding a tablet across the table. "Production efficiency is up 47%, employee satisfaction scores have improved dramatically, and we're ahead of schedule on the equipment modernization program." Elena nodded, scanning the data with the same analytical precision she'd once applied to intelligence reports in Iraq. "What about the workforce retention numbers?" "Remarkable," David replied with genuine satisfaction. "0 layoffs, and we've actually added 21 new positions. The family support programs Maria implemented have become a model for our other facilities." Speaking of Maria, Elena's sister had transformed from a nervous young wife walking on eggshells around her in-laws to a confident executive who commanded respect throughout the company. Her director of community relations program had been so successful that 3 other corporations had approached Phoenix Digital about licensing the model. "The North Carolina facility is requesting expansion funding," David continued. "They want to add a 3rd shift to meet demand from the new government contracts." Elena smiled. The same Blackwell Industries that had been hemorrhaging money and facing bankruptcy was now profitable enough to consider major expansion. More importantly, the 800 families who had faced unemployment were now secure, with health benefits, retirement plans, and educational assistance for their children. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "Baby's first ultrasound today," Robert cried. Even Patricia teared up. "See you at dinner Sunday," Elena typed back. "Wouldn't miss it. Tell my future nephew-niece that Aunt Elena is setting up their college fund." The Sunday dinners at the Blackwell mansion had become a weekly tradition, though the atmosphere was dramatically different from Elena's first encounter with the family. Robert had embraced his new role as a proud grandfather-to-be, and had developed genuine respect for Elena's business acumen. He often sought her advice on investments, and had quietly enrolled in online courses to better understand the technology sector. Patricia's transformation had been more complex. The initial shock had given way to a kind of stunned acceptance, followed by what could only be described as desperate attempts to rebuild bridges she had burned so thoroughly. She'd started volunteering with veteran support organizations, attended military appreciation events, and had even asked Elena to help her understand what she'd gotten wrong about military families. The process hadn't been easy. Elena had no interest in pretending the insults had never happened, but she also recognized that grudges were poisonous to family relationships. Eventually they'd reached an understanding. Patricia would educate herself about military service and veteran issues, and Elena would gradually allow her back into the family circle. The real test had come 6 weeks ago, when Miss Catherine Pemberton had made another snide comment about government dependence. At a charity luncheon, Patricia had publicly corrected her, explaining that Elena Rodriguez was a decorated veteran, successful entrepreneur, and one of the most accomplished people in their community. The story had become social media gold when someone recorded Patricia's passionate defense of military families and veteran contributions to society. Elena's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed called James Harrison, Pentagon. Rodriguez, she answered with military crispness. Elena, it's Jim Harrison. I've got some news that's going to make your day. Colonel Harrison had been Elena's commanding officer during her second deployment, and had remained a mentor and friend through her transition to civilian business success. The Phoenix digital cybersecurity platform just prevented what could have been the largest infrastructure attack in U.S. history, he continued. NSA estimates you saved the country about $200 billion in damages, not to mention prevented massive civilian casualties. Elena felt a familiar surge of pride, not in the financial success, but in knowing her work was still protecting people. What's the timeline for public recognition? That's the thing. The president wants to present you with the Presidential Medal of Freedom next month. It's going to be a big ceremony, full media coverage. Your story's going to be everywhere. After hanging up, Elena sat quietly for a moment, thinking about the journey from that gas station confrontation 3 years ago to this moment. The soldier who had been dismissed as an uneducated charity case was about to receive the nation's highest civilian honor. Her assistant knocked and entered. Miss Rodriguez, your 4 p.m. is here. Elena looked up to see Patricia Blackwell standing in the doorway, looking nervous but determined. This had become another monthly tradition. Patricia's education sessions where she learned about military culture, veteran issues, and the realities of service families. Patricia, Elena said, gesturing to a chair, right on time. I brought something, Patricia said, pulling out a leather folder. It's a proposal for the country club's board meeting next week. Elena opened the folder and read the title, Proposal for Annual Military Appreciation Gala and Scholarship Fund. The detailed plan outlined a formal event to honor local veterans, with proceeds funding college scholarships for military children. The board was resistant at first, Patricia admitted, but I reminded them that their new largest corporate sponsor might have opinions about how veterans are treated in the community. Elena smiled. Patricia had learned to leverage her own social connections in service of better causes. This is excellent work, Patricia. Very thorough. I've been thinking about something you said that day at the club, Patricia continued hesitantly, about children needing proper role models. I realize now that I had it backwards. Elena waited patiently. My grandchild is incredibly lucky, Patricia said, her voice growing stronger. They'll grow up knowing their aunt is someone who served her country with honor, built a successful company from nothing, and uses her success to help others. That's the kind of role model every child should have. It was the closest thing to a full apology that Patricia had ever managed, and Elena recognized the genuine emotion behind the words. Speaking of your grandchild, Elena said, I've been thinking about expanding the Education Trust Fund into a broader scholarship program. Maybe call it the Blackwell Family Veterans Education Foundation. Patricia's eyes widened. You'd name it after our family. Well, it was your family's prejudice that inspired me to prove my worth, Elena replied with a slight smile. Seems fitting that your family name should now be associated with supporting the very people you once dismissed. That evening, Elena stood on the balcony of her Manhattan penthouse, looking out over the city she'd never imagined owning a piece of when she was a young soldier writing code in Iraq. Tomorrow, news of the presidential medal would break, and the story of the veteran who'd built a tech empire while serving her country would inspire countless others. But tonight she was thinking about a simpler truth: respect isn't given based on appearances, assumptions, or social status. It's earned through character, service, and the quiet dignity of doing what's right even when no one is watching. Her phone buzzed with another text from Maria. "Just heard about the presidential medal. I'm so proud to be your sister. Mom and Dad would be amazed." Elena typed back, "They'd be proud of both of us. See you Sunday for dinner. I have some big news to share with the family." As the sun set over Manhattan, Elena Rodriguez, decorated veteran tech mogul and soon-to-be presidential medal recipient, smiled at the thought of Sunday dinner with a family that had learned, sometimes the hard way, that true American success stories come in many different uniforms. The country club ladies who had once mocked her sister's charity case, military family, would soon be watching their former target receive the nation's highest honor on national television. It was, Elena reflected, the most satisfying kind of justice, the kind that lifts others up while teaching important lessons about the dangers of judging people by their appearance rather than their character. Some battles are won with superior firepower, others are won with superior character. Elena had mastered both. The White House rose garden had never looked more beautiful than it did on that crisp October morning, with golden autumn light filtering through the changing leaves as dignitaries, military officials, and family members gathered for the Presidential Medal of Freedom ceremony. Elena stood in the receiving line, her dress blue uniform bearing every ribbon and decoration she'd earned through 8 years of service. But today would add the highest honor a civilian could receive. Maria sat in the front row, 7 months pregnant and glowing with pride, flanked by Robert and Patricia Blackwell. The transformation in Patricia was remarkable. The woman who had once dismissed military families as unsuitable influences on children now wore a small American flag pin and had tears of genuine pride streaming down her face. "Ladies and gentlemen," the president began, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd, "today we honor individuals whose contributions to our nation exemplify the very best of American innovation, service, and character." Elena's mind drifted to the journey that had brought her to this moment. The story of her confrontation with the Blackwell family had become legendary in veteran circles, shared at VFW halls and military bases across the country. But it had also sparked something larger, a national conversation about the hidden talents and contributions of America's veteran community. Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez, the president continued, exemplifies the warrior-scholar tradition that has made our military the finest in the world. While serving 2 combat tours in Iraq, she developed cybersecurity innovations that now protect our nation's critical infrastructure and employ thousands of Americans. The audience applauded, but Elena noticed something else. In the third row sat Miss Catherine Pemberton and Margaret Ashworth, the same society ladies who had participated in her humiliation months earlier. Their presence wasn't coincidental. They were here as part of Patricia's guest list, another step in what had become Patricia's mission to repair the damage her prejudices had caused. After the ceremony, as guests mingled during the reception, Elena found herself surrounded by admirers, fellow veterans, and business leaders. But the conversation that mattered most came when Patricia approached with Mrs. Pemberton in tow. "Elena," Patricia said, her voice steady despite her obvious nervousness, "Catherine has something she'd like to say." Mrs. Pemberton, who had once suggested that children needed better role models than soldiers, looked genuinely humbled. "Miss Rodriguez, Elena, I owe you an apology that's long overdue. My comments that day were inexcusable, born from ignorance and prejudice I'm ashamed to admit I harbored." Elena studied the older woman's face, seeing genuine remorse rather than social necessity. "Miss Pemberton, I appreciate that. I've been doing research," Catherine continued, "learning about military families, veteran contributions to business and technology. Did you know that veterans start businesses at twice the rate of civilians? That they're responsible for some of our most innovative companies?" Elena nodded. "I did know that, but I'm glad you took the time to learn it. I've established a scholarship fund," Catherine said quickly, as if the words might escape if she didn't say them fast enough. "The Pemberton Family Veterans Scholarship. It will support children of military families pursuing STEM education. I hope you'll consider serving on the selection board. It was a remarkable transformation. The woman who had once dismissed veteran families was now dedicating her family's resources to supporting them. Elena recognized the genuine desire for redemption and the courage it took for someone of Catherine's generation and background to admit she'd been fundamentally wrong. "I'd be honored to serve on the board," Elena replied, extending her hand. Later that evening, Elena found herself at a private dinner hosted by the Secretary of Defense, surrounded by Pentagon officials, defense contractors, and policymakers. The conversation naturally turned to Phoenix Digital's latest innovations and government contract. Elena, General Patricia Morrison, the Army's highest-ranking female officer, leaned forward with interest. "I've been following your company's work with veteran employment. The transition assistance programs you've developed are revolutionary." Elena smiled. "It started as a way to help military families, but we've discovered that veterans bring unique skill sets to civilian careers, if employers know how to recognize and utilize them. The problem," added Secretary Harrison, "is that many employers still don't understand military experience. They see the uniform and think follows orders rather than leadership, innovation, problem-solving under pressure." "Exactly what happened to me," Elena agreed. "People made assumptions based on appearances rather than capability. It's why Phoenix Digital now partners with over 200 companies to educate them about veteran hiring. We've placed more than 3,000 veterans in civilian careers over the past year." Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the Department of Veterans Affairs joined the conversation. "Your sister's family support programs have become a national model. We're recommending them for implementation at military bases nationwide." Elena felt a surge of pride for Maria, who had transformed from an intimidated military spouse hiding her background to a confident executive whose innovations were improving lives across the country. The Blackwell Foundation Gala last month raised $2.3 million. Elena, Patricia Blackwell, my former critic turned advocate, has become one of our most effective champions for veteran causes. General Morrison shook her head in amazement. "From enemy to ally, that's some transformation." "People can change when they're given the opportunity to see the truth," Elena replied. Patricia's prejudices weren't malicious. They were based on ignorance and stereotypes. Once she learned the reality of military service and veteran contributions, she became a powerful advocate. The conversation was interrupted by an aide who whispered something to Secretary Harrison. His face lit up with excitement. "Elena, you need to hear this. Forbes just released their annual list of America's most innovative companies. Phoenix Digital is number 7, the highest-ranking veteran-owned business in the list's history." The table erupted in congratulations, but Elena's mind was already racing ahead to what this recognition could mean for other veteran entrepreneurs, for changing perceptions about military experience in the business world. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria. "Watching the news coverage of your ceremony. Baby girl kicked when she heard your speech. I think she's proud of her aunt." Elena typed back, "Baby girl, you found out? Surprise." Patricia suggested we name her Elena. "What do you think?" Elena stared at the message, overwhelmed by the symbolism. The woman who had once questioned whether military families could provide proper guidance for children now wanted her grandchild to carry the name of the soldier she had dismissed. As the evening wound down and Elena prepared to leave the Pentagon's private dining room, General Morrison pulled her aside. "Elena, I want you to know that your story, not just the business success but how you handled that confrontation with dignity and used it to create positive change, has become required reading at the War College. We're teaching future officers that the battles they'll fight after service may be just as important as the ones they fight in uniform." Elena thought about that as her driver navigated through Washington traffic back to her hotel. The confrontation at the country club, which had started as a painful family embarrassment, had somehow evolved into a catalyst for national change in how veterans were perceived and treated. Tomorrow she would fly back to New York for a board meeting, where Phoenix Digital would announce its largest government contract ever, a $500 million cybersecurity program that would employ 2,000 people, with priority hiring for veterans. The same week, Maria would be featured on the cover of Business Weekly for her innovative family support programs. But tonight, Elena reflected on a simpler truth. sometimes the most important victories happen long after the original battle is won. Patricia Blackwell's transformation from critic to champion would impact thousands of veteran families for generations. Mrs. Pemberton's scholarship fund would send military children to college for decades. The companies that learned to properly value veteran employees would strengthen both their businesses and their communities. As Elena looked out at the monuments and memorials of Washington, D.C., she realized that her greatest success wasn't the money, the medals, or the recognition. It was proving that changing hearts and minds was possible, that prejudice could be overcome with patience and example, and that one person's dignity in the face of injustice could ripple outward to create lasting positive change. The soldier who had been dismissed as a charity case was now helping reshape how America saw and treated its veterans. Some fights, Elena knew, were worth every difficult moment it took to win them. 1 year later, Elena Rodriguez stood at the podium of the same garden room at Pinehurst Country Club, where her sister's baby shower had taken place, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Instead of condescending society ladies, the room was filled with veteran entrepreneurs, military families, corporate executives, and government officials gathered for the inaugural Heroes in Business Summit, an event that had grown from Patricia Blackwell's guilt-driven charity work into a national movement. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The same room where Elena had been dismissed as an unemployable soldier now hosted a conference celebrating veteran business achievements, with Elena as the keynote speaker, addressing an audience that included 3 Fortune 500 CEOs, 2 senators, and the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. A year ago, Elena began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. Someone in this very space suggested that military families couldn't provide proper guidance for children, that soldiers were essentially welfare recipients who had never accomplished anything meaningful. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter ran through the audience. Many had heard the story, but hearing it told in the actual location where it happened added dramatic weight to her words. Today, I want to talk about what we've accomplished since then, not just as individuals, but as a community that refused to accept limitations placed on us by others' prejudices. In the front row, Maria sat holding baby Elena Patricia Blackwell Rodriguez. Yes, Patricia had insisted on including her own name as a middle name, calling it penance and pride combined. At 9 months old, little Elena had already become the unofficial mascot of the veteran business community, appearing in magazine articles about military family success stories. Beside Maria, Patricia Blackwell looked radiant in her new role as grandmother and veteran advocate. The transformation was so complete that people meeting her for the first time would never believe she had once harbored such prejudices. She now served on the boards of 3 veteran-focused nonprofits and had personally recruited dozens of wealthy families to support veteran causes. The Phoenix Digital Veterans Business Incubator has now launched 127 companies, Elena continued, employing over 4,000 people and generating 300. These aren't charity cases or government handouts. These are profitable businesses, solving real problems and creating real value. The audience applauded, but Elena noticed Robert Blackwell in the 3rd row, beaming with pride as if Elena were his own daughter. His textile company, now a thriving subsidiary of Phoenix Digital, had become a showcase for how traditional manufacturing could embrace technology while honoring its heritage. But numbers only tell part of the story, Elena said, her tone becoming more personal. The real victory is in changing how our society sees military service, not as a last resort for people who can't succeed elsewhere, but as a proving ground that produces leaders, innovators, and entrepreneurs. Marcus Thompson, a Marine veteran who had used his Phoenix Digital Fellowship to launch a revolutionary prosthetics company, stood up in the audience. Elena, when corporate recruiters told me my military experience wasn't relevant to medical device development, I almost gave up. Your program didn't just give me funding, it gave me proof that my leadership under fire was exactly what the business world needed. Elena smiled. Marcus now employs 89 people and his prosthetics are helping veterans across the country. That's the real return on investment, not just in dollars, but in dignity restored and potential realized. The summit had attracted national media attention. CNN's business correspondent, interviewing guests during the lunch break, had called it a seismic shift in how America thinks about veteran transition and entrepreneurship. The New York Times business section was preparing a cover story titled, "From Battlefield to Boardroom, The New Veteran Advantage." But for Elena, the most meaningful moment came during the afternoon panel when Mrs. Catherine Pemberton took the stage as a featured speaker. The woman who had once sneered at military families was now introducing a veteran entrepreneur whose company she had personally funded. "I stand before you today humbled and changed," Catherine said, her voice steady but emotional. 18 months ago, I was ignorant enough to believe that military service was somehow lesser than civilian achievement. I was wrong in ways I'm still discovering. She gestured to the veteran entrepreneur beside her, Captain Jessica Martinez, who had developed an AI-powered logistics platform after serving 3 tours in Afghanistan. Jessica's company will revolutionize supply chain management for every major retailer in America. But more than that, she's proving that the skills our military develops, adaptability, leadership under pressure, innovative problem-solving, are exactly what our economy needs. Catherine paused, looking directly at Elena. "I learned this lesson through shame and correction. I pray others can learn it through example instead." The applause was thunderous, but Elena noticed tears in Catherine's eyes. The journey from prejudice to advocacy wasn't easy, especially for someone who had to acknowledge how fundamentally wrong they'd been. After the formal sessions ended, Elena found herself in the club's library, the same quiet space where she'd once been told she didn't belong, surrounded by veteran entrepreneurs sharing success stories and planning collaboration. The energy was electric as former soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen discussed everything from artificial intelligence to renewable energy to space technology. "Elena," a voice called from the doorway. She turned to see General Patricia Morrison, whom she'd met at the Pentagon dinner the year before. "Got a minute?" They stepped onto the library's private balcony overlooking the golf course where wealthy men had once played while dismissing the very people who protected their freedom to do so. "The President wants to nominate you for Secretary of Veterans Affairs," General Morrison said without preamble. "The position comes open next year, and your name is at the top of the list." Elena was quiet for a long moment, watching golfers in the distance. "That's unexpected. You've become the most visible advocate for veteran economic empowerment in the country. Your business success gives you credibility with Republicans, your military service resonates with Democrats, and your programs have bipartisan support. Plus," General Morrison smiled, "you've proven you can turn enemies into allies." Elena thought about Patricia, about Mrs. Pemberton, about all the corporate executives who had learned to see military experience as an asset rather than a liability. "I'd have to give up Phoenix Digital. You'd have to step back from day-to-day operations, but think about the impact. Department of Veterans Affairs has a $300 billion budget and touches the lives of 19 million veterans. You could institutionalize everything you've built on a national scale." As if summoned by their conversation, Maria appeared on the balcony carrying baby Elena, with Patricia close behind. 4 generations of women, grandmother Patricia, Aunt Elena, Mother Maria, and baby Elena, representing a transformation that seemed impossible just 18 months ago. "What are you all plotting out here?" Maria asked, settling into a chair while the baby gurgled happily. "Just discussing how to change the world," Elena replied, taking her namesake niece into her arms. The baby grabbed at Elena's business suit lapel with the same determination Elena had once shown when refusing to be intimidated by bullies. Patricia, who had remained quiet, finally spoke. "Elena, whatever opportunity they're discussing, I hope you know you have our complete support. This family, this community owes you more than we can ever repay." Elena looked out over the country club grounds, remembering the woman who had walked in here alone, underestimated and dismissed, carrying nothing but her own dignity and hidden achievement. Now she stood surrounded by family, with a thriving business empire, national recognition, and the opportunity to serve veterans on an unprecedented scale. "You know what I've learned?" Elena said, gently bouncing baby Elena. "The most important battles aren't always fought with weapons. Sometimes they're fought with patience, with excellence, with refusing to let other people's limitations become your own." She looked at Patricia, who had tears in her eyes. "Sometimes the greatest victory is helping your former enemies become your strongest ally." As the sun set over Pinehurst Country Club, Elena Rodriguez, veteran entrepreneur, advocate, and future cabinet secretary, held her niece and thought about the little girl's future. Unlike her aunt, baby Elena would grow up in a world where military service was respected, where veteran entrepreneurs were celebrated, and where prejudice had been replaced by pride. The soldier who had been told to know her place had ultimately redefined what that place could be, not just for herself, but for every veteran who would follow in her footsteps. Some battles end in victory, the best battles end in transformation. 2 years after the presidential medal ceremony, Elena Rodriguez faced her greatest challenge yet, not in a boardroom or on a battlefield, but in the marble halls of the United States Senate during her confirmation hearings for Secretary of Veterans Affairs. The ornate committee room was packed with senators, media, and observers, including a special section reserved for veteran entrepreneurs whose lives had been changed by Elena's program. Senator Margaret Walsh of Connecticut, the committee chairwoman and a longtime champion of veteran causes, gaveled the hearing to order. We're here today to consider the nomination of Miss Elena Rodriguez to serve as Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Ms. Rodriguez, you have 5 minutes for opening remarks. Elena stood at the witness table, her bearing confident, but respectful. Behind her in the gallery sat an extraordinary collection of supporters: Maria, holding 2-year-old Elena, Patricia and Robert Blackwell, Miss Catherine Pemberton, dozens of veteran entrepreneurs, and even some of her former military commanders. But she also knew that critics were watching, skeptical of whether a relatively young veteran could manage the massive VA bureaucracy. Chairman Walsh, distinguished members of the committee, Elena began, I appear before you today, not just as a veteran seeking to serve veterans, but as someone who has lived the challenges our military families face during and after service. Senator Thomas Bradley of Texas, known for his skeptical questioning, leaned forward. Ms. Rodriguez, your business success is impressive, but the VA serves 19 million veterans with a budget of $300 billion. How do we know you can manage something that large and complex? Elena had anticipated this question. Senator Bradley, Phoenix Digital currently operates across 47 states with 12,000 employees and manages $2.8 billion in annual contracts. But more importantly, every innovation I've implemented has been tested first with veteran community. I don't theorize about veteran needs. I live them, breathe them, and solve them. Senator Bradley wasn't finished. Your nomination has been controversial in some circles. Critics say you're too young, too focused on business solutions, and that your confrontation with the Blackwell family shows a vindictive streak unsuitable for public service. The room went completely silent. Elena could see Maria tense in the gallery, but Patricia Blackwell surprised everyone by starting to stand before Robert gently pulled her back down. Elena's response was measured and calm. Senator, I understand the concern about the Blackwell incident, but I'd ask the committee to consider what actually happened, and what it led to. She turned slightly to acknowledge Patricia in the gallery. Mrs. Patricia Blackwell, who was involved in that incident, has become one of the nation's most effective advocates for veteran causes. Her foundation has provided $47 million in scholarships and support services. She transformed from someone who misunderstood military service into someone who champions it. Elena paused, letting that sink in. The measure of leadership isn't avoiding conflict, it's how you handle conflict to create positive change. That incident led to national conversations about veteran stereotypes, policy changes in corporate hiring practices, and programs that have helped thousands of military families. Senator Jennifer Martinez of Arizona, herself a veteran, leaned into her microphone. Ms. Rodriguez, can you give us specific examples of how your business experience would translate to VA management? Absolutely, Senator Martinez. At Phoenix Digital, we reduced veteran unemployment in our partner companies by 73%. Using data-driven matching algorithms, we cut bureaucratic processing time from weeks to days. By streamlining digital systems, we improved family support services by treating military spouses as assets rather than dependents. Elena clicked a remote, and a presentation appeared on screens around the room. If confirmed, I would implement these same innovations across the VA system. Digital-first claims processing, AI-assisted disability assessments, and comprehensive family support programs that we've already proven work at scale. Senator Robert Chen of California raised his hand. Rodriguez, your critics point out that you've been quite public about your disagreements with how veterans are sometimes treated. Do you think you can work collaboratively with people who may have different perspectives? Before Elena could answer, something unexpected happened. Patricia Blackwell stood up in the gallery, and spoke clearly. "Senator Chen, may I address that question?" The chairman looked confused. "Ma'am, this isn't a public comment period." "Chairman Walsh," Patricia said with the commanding presence she'd once used to intimidate Elena, "I believe I have unique insight into Ms. Rodriguez's character that directly addresses the senator's concern." Elena turned to look at Patricia, genuinely surprised. "They hadn't planned this. I was wrong about Ms. Rodriguez," Patricia continued, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "Spectacularly, embarrassingly wrong. I insulted her service, her character and her family. I suggested she was unemployable and a bad influence on children." Murmurs rippled through the room as senators and observers realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. "Ms. Rodriguez could have destroyed me socially, financially, and personally," Patricia said, her voice growing stronger. "Instead, she chose patience. She chose education over revenge. She turned me from an enemy into an advocate, not through punishment, but through example." Patricia looked directly at the senators. "If you're looking for someone who can work with difficult people, with people who misunderstand or oppose veteran issues, then Elena Rodriguez is exactly who you need. She didn't just tolerate my ignorance, she cured it." The room erupted in spontaneous applause. Even some of the skeptical senators looked moved by Patricia's testimony. Chairman Walsh gavelled for order. "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwell. Ms. Rodriguez, do you have anything to add?" Elena stood, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. "Chairman Walsh, leading the VA means serving veterans who may disagree with my methods, working with Congress members who question my priorities, and changing systems that resist change." Mrs. Blackwell's transformation shows that hearts and minds can be changed through patient leadership and proven results. Senator Bradley, who had been taking notes throughout Patricia's impromptu testimony, looked up. "Ms. Rodriguez, one final question. The VA has been criticized for being slow to change, resistant to innovation. How would you handle institutional resistance?" Elena smiled, thinking about 3 bikers at a gas station, condescending society ladies, and every person who had ever underestimated her. "Senator, I've been handling institutional resistance my entire career, in the military, in business, and in life. The key is proving your value through excellence, maintaining respect for those who oppose you, and never giving up on the mission." "And what is the mission?" Senator Bradley asked. "To ensure that every veteran who served our country receives the respect, support, and opportunities they've earned, to transform the VA from a bureaucracy that veterans endure, into a partner that empowers them, and to prove that military service isn't the end of someone's contribution to America, it's the beginning." The questioning continued for 3 more hours, covering everything from budget management, to healthcare reform, to disability claims processing. Elena answered each question with the same combination of military precision and business acumen that had built her empire. As the hearing concluded, Chairman Walsh announced that the committee would vote the following week. Elena gathered her materials, knowing she'd done everything possible to make her case. In the hallway afterward, she was surrounded by well-wishers and reporters, but the moment that mattered most came when Patricia approached with baby Elena in her arms. "Thank you," Elena said quietly. "You didn't have to do that." Patricia smiled, the same woman who had once dismissed Elena as unemployable. "Yes, I did. That little girl," she gestured to her granddaughter, "deserves to grow up in a country where veterans are properly served, and you're the person who can make that happen." Baby Elena reached for her aunt, grabbing her suit jacket with tiny hands. Elena took her niece, thinking about the world she was fighting to create, one where military service was valued, where veteran contributions were recognized, and where a soldier's daughter could grow up knowing her family's sacrifice meant something. 3 days later, the Senate voted 87-13 to confirm Elena Rodriguez as the 12th Secretary of Veterans Affairs. The woman who had once been told she didn't belong in polite society was now preparing to serve in the president's cabinet. But as Elena prepared for her swearing-in ceremony, she knew the real work was just beginning. Transforming the VA would require the same patience, determination, and excellence that had transformed Patricia Blackwell from enemy to ally. Some battles end when you win. The most important battles never really end, they just evolve into the next fight for justice, dignity, and the recognition that every American deserves. 5 years after her confirmation as Secretary of Veterans Affairs, Elena Rodriguez stood before the largest gathering of veterans in American history. The National Mall stretched endlessly before her, filled with over 500,000 veterans, active duty service members and their families who had come to Washington for the first ever Veterans Victory Day, a new national holiday she had helped establish to celebrate veteran contributions to American society. The stage, positioned on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, offered a commanding view of the crowd that extended all the way to the Washington Monument. Among the sea of faces, Elena could see representatives from every branch of service, every era of conflict, and every demographic that made up America's veteran community. But in the VIP section directly in front of the stage, she spotted the faces that mattered most. Maria sat in the front row, now pregnant with her second child, beside 4-year-old Elena Patricia Blackwell Rodriguez, who wore a miniature dress uniform that made her look like a tiny soldier. Beside them sat Patricia and Robert Blackwell, both now in their 70s, but vibrant with purpose as they dedicated their remaining years to veteran advocacy. Mrs. Catherine Pemberton, now 78, sat with them wearing a veteran supporter t-shirt that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. "Fellow Americans," Elena began, her voice amplified across the National Mall by a sophisticated sound system, "we gather today not to celebrate war, but to celebrate the warriors who secured our peace. Not to glorify conflict, but to honor the character forged in service to something greater than ourselves." The crowd erupted in sustained applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the monuments surrounding them. Elena paused, looking out over the sea of people whose lives had been touched by her reforms at the Department of Veterans Affairs. In her 5 years as secretary, Elena had overseen the most comprehensive transformation in VA history. The bureaucratic nightmare that had once taken months to process claims now operated with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 company. Digital-first systems had reduced wait times from an average of 20. Veteran unemployment had dropped to historic lows through innovative job placement programs. Most importantly, veteran suicide rates had declined by 34% through expanded mental health services and peer support networks. "When I first took this job," Elena continued, "critics said a young veteran couldn't manage such a complex organization. They said business principles wouldn't work in government. They said the VA was too broken to fix." She gestured toward the massive crowd. "Look around you. This is what happens when we refuse to accept limitations others place on us. This is what happens when we choose excellence over excuses, innovation over bureaucracy, and hope over cynicism." In the audience, Marcus Thompson, the Marine veteran, whose prosthetics company had grown into a medical device empire, stood and applauded. Beside him was Captain Jessica Martinez, whose logistics AI now powered supply chains for half the fortune. They were just two of the thousands of veteran entrepreneurs whose success stories had reshaped American perceptions of military service. "But transformation isn't just about systems and statistics," Elena said, her voice growing more personal. "It's about changing hearts and minds. It's about proving that military service doesn't limit your potential, it amplifies it." At that moment, something extraordinary happened. Patricia Blackwell stood up in the VIP section and began to applaud. The action rippled through the crowd as cameras captured the image of the woman who had once dismissed military families, now giving Elena a standing ovation. Within seconds, the entire National Mall was on its feet. Elena waited for the applause to die down before continuing. "5 years ago, a wise woman told me I needed to know my place. She was right. My place, our place, is wherever excellence, integrity, and service to others can make a difference." She looked directly at Patricia, who had tears streaming down her face. "Sometimes our greatest teachers are the people who challenge us to prove our worth. Sometimes our strongest allies are those who first forced us to find our strength." The speech continued for 20 more minutes, covering policy achievements, success stories, and the vision for America's veteran community. But the moment that would be remembered, the clip that would go viral and be shared millions of times, came near the end when Elena called Patricia Blackwell to join her on stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elena said as Patricia climbed the steps to the Lincoln Memorial platform, I want to introduce someone who embodies the transformation we're celebrating today. Mrs. Patricia Blackwell was once skeptical of military family. Today she chairs the National Veterans Education Foundation and has raised over $200 million for veteran causes. Patricia took the microphone with trembling hands. At 73, she had never spoken to a crowd this large, but her voice carried clearly across the National Mall. 5 years ago, I was wrong about everything. Patricia said simply, I was wrong about military service, wrong about veteran families, and spectacularly wrong about Elena Rodriguez. But she didn't destroy me for my ignorance. She educated me. She didn't seek revenge. She sought understanding. Patricia's voice grew stronger as she continued. If an old, prejudiced woman like me can learn to see the truth about our veterans, then anyone can. If I can go from being part of the problem to being part of the solution, then transformation is possible for everyone. The crowd's response was thunderous. Veterans who had faced discrimination, skepticism, and misunderstanding saw in Patricia's transformation proof that minds could be changed and hearts could be opened. Later that evening, at the private reception in the secretary's office, Elena found herself surrounded by the people who had shaped her journey. General Patricia Morrison, now retired, raised a toast to the soldier who proved that the best battles are won not with weapons, but with character. But the moment that meant the most came when 4-year-old Elena Patricia toddled over to her aunt, carrying a drawing she had made. It showed stick figures of her family, but in the center was a figure in uniform with the caption, Aunt Elena, American Hero, written in crooked letters. Is this for me? Elena asked, kneeling down to her niece's level. Yes, the little girl exclaimed. Grandma Patricia says you make the world better for soldier families. Elena looked at Patricia, who was watching the exchange with pure joy. The woman who had once questioned whether military families could provide proper guidance for children had become the person teaching the next generation to honor military service. As the reception wound down and guests began to leave, Elena stood alone in her office, looking out at the illuminated monuments of Washington. Her journey from a dismissed soldier at a country club to Secretary of Veterans Affairs seemed almost impossible to believe. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria. Watched your speech on TV. The baby kicked when you mentioned transformation. I think she approves of her aunt's work. Elena typed back, tell her that Aunt Elena is just getting started. This is only the beginning. And it was true. Elena had announced earlier that week that she would be stepping down as secretary to run for the U.S. Senate, with Patricia Blackwell as her campaign chairwoman. The woman who had once told Elena to know her place would now help her claim a place in the highest levels of American government. As Elena prepared to leave her office, she paused at the photo on her desk, the picture from Maria's baby shower 5 years ago, showing Elena in her dress uniform surrounded by condescending faces. She kept it as a reminder that every person deserves the chance to prove their worth, and that the most unlikely people can become your greatest allies. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles for veteran dignity and recognition. But tonight, Elena Rodriguez, veteran, entrepreneur, secretary and future senator, knew that she had kept faith with every soldier who had ever been underestimated, every veteran who had ever been dismissed, and every military family who had ever been told they didn't belong. The soldier who had been told to know her place had ultimately redefined what that place could be, not just for herself, but for every veteran who would follow in her footsteps. Some victories echo through history. This one would echo through generations. The attack was brutal, and it was everywhere. Elena Rodriguez sat in her campaign headquarters in downtown Albany, watching the commercial that had been running on every major network for the past week. The screen showed grainy surveillance footage from the Pinehurst Country Club confrontation 6 years ago, with a narrator's ominous voice describing her as temperamental, vindictive, and unsuitable for the dignified deliberation required in the U.S. Senate. Rodriguez humiliated private citizens for personal revenge. The narrator intoned over slowed-down footage of Elena speaking calmly at the baby shower. She used her position as a government official to settle personal scores. Is this the character we want representing New York in Washington? Maria, now 7 months pregnant with her third child, muted the television with visible disgust. They're using the same footage but making it look like you were the aggressor. How is that even legal? Elena's campaign manager, David Chen, who had left Phoenix Digital to run her Senate race, looked up from his laptop with grim determination. It's legal because it's technically accurate footage. They're just editing it to completely reverse the context. The ad was the brainchild of Senator William Crawford's campaign. Crawford, the 3-term incumbent, had initially dismissed Elena as a novice who would be easy to defeat. That was before her fundraising numbers came in, $47 million in the first quarter, with donations from veterans nationwide and major corporate donors who had worked with Phoenix Digital. Crawford's internal polling showed him trailing by 8 points. "What's our response strategy?" asked Patricia Blackwell, who had become Elena's most trusted campaign advisor. At 74, Patricia had thrown herself into politics with the same intensity she'd once brought to society events, and her connections to New York's wealthy donor class had been invaluable. "We tell the truth," Elena said simply, but David shook his head. "Elena, we've tried that. We released the full footage. We've had Patricia do interviews explaining what really happened. But 15-second attack ads are more powerful than 20-minute explanation. People don't have time for context." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Elena's greatest strength, her ability to transform enemies into allies, was being weaponized against her by an opponent desperate to keep his seat. Elena's phone buzzed with a text from her deputy at the VA. "Just saw the ad. All the senior staff want you to know, we've got your back." The work speaks for itself. But would the work be enough? Crawford's campaign had found Elena's one vulnerability. The very incident that had launched her journey to national prominence could be reframed as evidence of poor judgment and vindictive character. "There's more," David said reluctantly. "Crawford's people have been reaching out to other families from Maria's social circle. They're looking for anyone else who might have had a negative interaction with Elena to come forward." Patricia's face went white. "They're trying to find more people like I used to be." "Exactly. And if they find even one person willing to say Elena was rude or dismissive." Elena stood up, her military bearing taking over. "Then we fight back with facts." "David, I want you to compile every metric from my time at the VA, every improvement, every life saved, every dollar saved. I want testimony from veterans whose lives were changed by our programs." "That's defense," David replied. "We need offense. We need something that puts Crawford on the defensive." The opportunity came sooner than anyone expected. 3 days later, Elena was touring a veterans rehabilitation facility in Syracuse when her security detail received an urgent call. There had been a major cyber attack on the state's power grid, the kind of sophisticated assault that could have crippled infrastructure across New York. "Ma'am," her security chief said quietly, "they're asking if Phoenix Digital's cyber security team can assist with the response." Elena didn't hesitate. "Make the call." Within hours, Phoenix Digital's emergency response team was working with state authorities to trace and neutralize the attack. Elena herself, despite being in the middle of a Senate campaign, spent 18 hours in the state's Cyber Security Command Center, using her expertise to help coordinate the response. The attack was stopped, the power grid was secure, and every major news outlet in the state covered Elena's hands-on role in preventing what could have been a catastrophic attack on critical infrastructure. But Crawford's response revealed the kind of politician he truly was. At a press conference the following day, Crawford criticized Elena for grandstanding during a crisis, and suggested that her involvement was a publicity stunt designed to distract from her character problems. The backlash was immediate and severe. General Patricia Morrison, now working as a defense contractor, held her own press conference. Elena Rodriguez didn't just talk about cybersecurity during her time at the VA. She revolutionized it. The same system she developed to protect veteran data helped stop this attack. Senator Crawford's comments show a fundamental misunderstanding of both cybersecurity and leadership. But the most powerful response came from an unexpected source, the governor of New York. Governor Sarah Martinez had worked closely with Elena during the VA transformation, and had seen firsthand how Elena's innovations had improved veteran services in New York. At her daily briefing, she made a statement that would reshape the entire race. "I want to be clear about what happened during the cyber attack," Governor Martinez said, looking directly into the news cameras. "Elena Rodriguez didn't insert herself into our response for political gain. We called her. Her expertise was essential to protecting our state's infrastructure. And frankly, I'd rather have a senator who knows how to solve problems than one who only knows how to create them." The tide began to turn that afternoon. Editorial boards that had been skeptical of Elena's candidacy began publishing endorsements. Veteran organizations across the state issued statements of support. Most importantly, Crawford's own fundraising began to dry up, as donors realized he was on the wrong side of a genuine hero's story. But Elena knew the real test would come at the first televised debate, scheduled for the following week. Crawford would undoubtedly try to make the Blackwell incident the centerpiece of his attack, and she would need to address it head-on in front of millions of viewers. "I want Patricia there," Elena told her campaign team, "front row, center. If Crawford wants to relitigate what happened at that country club, he can do it in front of the woman who was actually there." David looked concerned. "Elena, that's risky. If Crawford goes after Patricia directly, then he'll show the state exactly what kind of man he is," Elena replied. "Patricia has spent 6 years proving that people can change, that redemption is possible, that even the worst prejudices can be overcome through patience and example. If Crawford wants to attack that transformation, let him." Patricia, who had been quiet during the strategy session, finally spoke up. "Elena, I've been thinking about something. That attack ad, it shows me at my worst moment, when I was ignorant and cruel, but it doesn't show what happened next." "What do you mean?" Patricia smiled, and Elena could see the spark of an idea forming. "What if we showed them what happened next? What if we told the complete story, not just the confrontation, but the transformation, not just the conflict, but the resolution?" Elena looked at her former enemy, turned campaign chair, the woman who had traveled from prejudice to advocacy, from ignorance to understanding. "Patricia, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we turn your greatest vulnerability into your greatest strength. We show the people of New York that the incident at the country club wasn't a character flaw, it was a character revelation. It showed that you don't seek revenge against people who wrong you, you seek to transform them." Elena felt a familiar surge of hope, the same feeling she'd experienced when facing down challenges in Iraq, when building Phoenix Digital, when transforming the VA. "And how do we do that?" Patricia's smile grew wide. "We invite Senator Crawford to meet the hundreds of people whose lives you've changed. We show him the veteran entrepreneurs, the military families, the former skeptics like me, who became believers. We make this campaign about transformation, not just of individuals, but of entire systems and communities." David was nodding enthusiastically now. "A transformation tour. We visit every county in New York, and at each stop, we highlight someone whose life was changed by Elena's work. We make Crawford defend the status quo while Elena demonstrates real change." Elena looked around the room at her team, her sister Maria, her former enemy Patricia, her trusted advisor David, and the dozens of volunteers who believed in her vision for America. The attack ad was still playing silently on the television screen, but it no longer seemed threatening. "Let's show New York what transformation looks like," Elena said, "and let's give Senator Crawford the choice. He can either be part of the solution, or he can be left behind by the change that's already happening." The real campaign was about to begin. The Eastman Theater in Rochester was packed beyond capacity for the most anticipated Senate debate in New York history. National media had descended on the historic venue, recognizing that this wasn't just a contest between two candidates. It was a referendum on whether America was ready for a new kind of political leadership. Elena Rodriguez stood at her podium, her bearing calm and confident, despite the stage. Across the stage, Senator William Crawford adjusted his tie nervously, his usual political swagger somewhat diminished by the events of the past month. Between them sat moderator Rachel Thompson, from Channel 7 News, with a stack of questions that promised to cut straight to the heart of both candidates' fitness for office. In the front row, exactly as Elena had planned, sat Patricia Blackwell. The 74-year-old looked elegant but determined, knowing that tonight she might be called upon to defend not just Elena's character, but the very possibility of redemption and transformation in American politics. "Good evening," Thompson began. "Let's start with the question on everyone's mind. Ms. Rodriguez, 6 years ago you were involved in a confrontation at a private social event that your opponent says demonstrates poor judgment and vindictive character. How do you respond?" Elena had prepared for this moment for weeks, but she also knew that no amount of preparation could substitute for simple truth. "Rachel, I'm glad you asked about that day, because it represents everything I believe about leadership and character." Elena's voice was steady, carrying the authority of someone who had commanded soldiers and led government agents. "6 years ago, I walked into a room where my sister was being humiliated, where military families were being dismissed as inferior, where service to our country was being mocked as welfare fraud." She paused, looking directly at Patricia. "I had two choices that day. I could have responded with anger, with personal attacks, with the kind of vindictive behavior Senator Crawford suggests I displayed, or I could have responded with dignity, with facts, and with a commitment to changing hearts and minds, rather than just winning arguments." Crawford seized his opportunity during the rebuttal period. "That's a nice story, Miss Rodriguez. But the footage shows you deliberately humiliating private citizens, using your position of power to settle personal scores. Is that the kind of leadership New Yorkers want in Washington?" The attack was exactly what Elena had expected, but Patricia Blackwell's response was not what anyone in the theater had anticipated. Patricia stood up from her front row seat. "Senator Crawford," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the theater's excellent acoustics, "I was one of those private citizens you're defending. Would you like to know what actually happened that day?" Thompson looked startled. "Miss Blackwell, this is highly irregular." "What's irregular?" Patricia replied, stepping toward the stage, "is allowing a politician to lie about events he didn't witness to attack the character of someone who showed more grace under pressure than I've seen in 40 years of politics." Crawford's face reddened. "Ma'am, I understand you're supporting Miss Rodriguez's campaign, but I'm supporting truth," Patricia interrupted. "6 years ago, I spent 20 minutes systematically insulting Elena Rodriguez's military service, her intelligence, her worth as a human being. I suggested she was unemployable, unsuitable to be around children, essentially a welfare recipient playing dress-up." The theater was completely silent now, the audience hanging on every word. "Elena Rodriguez could have destroyed me," Patricia continued, her voice growing strong. "She had the power, the resources, and frankly, the justification to ruin my life socially and financially. Instead, she chose patience. She chose education over revenge. She turned me from an ignorant enemy into an informed ally." Patricia looked directly at Crawford. "Senator, you're running against someone who doesn't just talk about bringing people together. She actually does it. She took someone who represented everything wrong with American attitudes toward military families, and helped me become an advocate for veteran causes." Crawford tried to regain control. "Mrs. Blackwell, that's a touching story, but it's not just a story," Patricia shot back. "It's a pattern. Elena Rodriguez has spent her entire career transforming systems, transforming organizations, transforming law. The VA went from a bureaucratic nightmare to a model of efficiency under her leadership. Veteran unemployment dropped to historic lows. Suicide rates among veterans fell by." Elena watched in amazement as Patricia, the woman who had once been her tormentor, became her most powerful defender on the most important night of her political career. "And you know what, Senator Crawford," Patricia continued, "if Elena Rodriguez can transform someone like me, someone who was so wrong about so much, imagine what she can do with a broken political system in Washington." The applause started slowly with scattered claps from veterans in the audience, but it built into a sustained ovation that forced Thompson to call for order. Crawford, clearly rattled, tried a different approach. "Ms. Rodriguez, your business background is impressive, but the Senate requires the ability to work across party lines, to find compromise. Your confrontational approach suggests—" "Confrontational?" Elena interrupted, her voice carrying a note of controlled incredulity. "Senator, I spent 5 years as Secretary of Veterans Affairs, working with Republican and Democratic members of Congress to pass the most comprehensive veteran support legislation in American history. The Veterans Success Act passed 90. Were you one of the 6 who opposed supporting our veterans? Crawford's silence was answer enough. Senator Crawford, Elena continued, you've spent 15 years in Washington, accomplishing what, exactly? What transformational legislation bears your name? What broken system have you fixed? What lives have you changed for the better? Thompson tried to give Crawford space to respond, but Elena wasn't finished. You're attacking me for transforming an enemy into an ally, for changing a broken bureaucracy into an efficient service organization, for proving that dignity and excellence can overcome prejudice and resistance. If that's confrontational, then I'm proud to be confrontational. The debate continued for another hour, covering healthcare, economic policy and foreign affairs. But every answer Elena gave came back to the same theme: transformation was possible, change was achievable, and leadership meant bringing out the best in people rather than exploiting their worst instincts. Crawford's responses became increasingly desperate as the evening wore on. He attacked Elena's age, her business background, her radical ideas about veteran support, but with each attack he looked smaller, more petty, more like exactly the kind of politician Americans were tired of seeing. The moment that would define the entire race came during closing statement. Crawford, clearly feeling defeated, made one final desperate attack. Ms. Rodriguez represents the worst of identity politics, using her military service and gender to claim special treatment. New Yorkers deserve a senator who's earned his position through experience, not publicity stunt. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Veterans in the audience began standing up, some removing their military hats in disgust. Patricia Blackwell shook her head in visible disappointment. Even some of Crawford's own supporters looked uncomfortable. Elena's response was measured but devastating. Senator Crawford, I've never asked for special treatment because I'm a veteran or because I'm a woman. I've asked to be judged on my results. The VA transformation that helped millions of veterans, the Phoenix digital innovations that protect our nation's infrastructure, the bipartisan legislation that expanded veteran benefits. She paused, looking out at the audience filled with people whose lives had been touched by her work. You call my military service identity politics. I call it 8 years of learning how to lead, under pressure, how to make life and death decisions, how to turn diverse teams into effective units. You call my business success a publicity stunt. I call it proof that American innovation and entrepreneurship are alive and well. Elena's voice rose slightly, carrying the passion that had driven her entire career. And you call my transformation of the VA special treatment. I call it exactly what New Yorkers sent you to Washington to do: fix broken systems, help struggling families, and prove that government can work for the people who need it most. The closing statement continued for 2 more minutes, but the race was effectively over. Post-debate polls would show Elena leading by 23 points, with Crawford's unfavorability ratings reaching levels that made re-election mathematically impossible. As the candidates left the stage, Patricia approached Elena with tears in her eyes. I'm proud of you, Patricia said simply, and I'm proud that I got to be part of your story. Elena hugged the woman who had taught her that transformation was always possible, even in the most unlikely circumstances. Patricia, you weren't just part of my story, you were the beginning of it. 3 weeks later, Elena Rodriguez would win the Senate race by the largest margin in New York history. But the real victory had happened on that debate stage, when American voters saw what leadership looked like when it was based on character rather than calculation, on transformation rather than destruction. The woman who had once been told to know her place was about to take her place among the most powerful legislators in the country, and she was bringing with her a new model of political leadership that prioritized redemption over revenge, solutions over soundbites, and the radical idea that even the most broken systems could be transformed by patience, excellence, and unwavering dignity. The United States Senate chamber had seen many historic moments, but rarely had the gallery been as packed as it was for Elena Rodriguez's first major floor speech as the junior senator from New York. Just 8 months after her landslide victory, Elena had already earned a reputation as someone who could bridge the bitter partisan divide that had paralyzed Washington for years. Today, she was introducing the American Transformation Act, the most comprehensive veteran reintegration and economic opportunity legislation in the nation's history. But more than that, she was proving that the leadership style that had transformed the VA could work in the most dysfunctional institution in American government. President Elena began, addressing the Senate President pro tempore. I rise today, not as a Democrat or a Republican, but as an American who believes that our greatest strength lies not in our ability to defeat our enemies, but in our ability to transform them into allies. In the gallery, Patricia Blackwell sat beside Maria, who held 6-year-old Elena Patricia and her newest baby, Michael Robert Blackwell Rodriguez. 3 generations of the family that had once been divided by prejudice now sat united in support of the woman who had taught them that transformation was always possible. The legislation I'm introducing today isn't just about veterans, Elena continued, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. It's about proving that America still believes in second chances, still believes in redemption, still believes that every person has untapped potential waiting to be discovered. Senator James Morrison of Alabama, a Republican and Vietnam veteran, nodded approvingly from across the aisle. Elena had spent months building relationships with conservative senators, many of whom had initially been skeptical of the young veteran who had taken Crawford's seat by such a dramatic margin. I want to tell you about a woman named Patricia Blackwell, Elena said, gesturing toward the gallery. 6 years ago, Mrs. Blackwell believed that military families were inferior, that veterans were unemployable charity cases, that service to our country was essentially welfare fraud. Patricia stood briefly, acknowledging the recognition with dignity despite the painful truth of Elena's words. Today, Mrs. Blackwell chairs the National Veterans Transformation Foundation, which has provided educational opportunities to over 50,000 military families. She has raised $400 million for veteran causes and has become one of the most effective advocates for military families in America. The applause from both sides of the aisle was immediate and sustained. Even the most partisan senators recognized the power of genuine redemption stories. The American Transformation Act recognizes that Ms. Blackwell's journey from skeptic to advocate isn't unique. It's exactly what happens when we invest in people's potential rather than writing them off because of their past. Elena outlined the bill's provisions, comprehensive job training programs that matched veteran skills with civilian careers, educational partnerships between businesses and military community, and mental health support systems that treated veteran transition as a community responsibility rather than an individual challenge. But the most innovative aspect was the Transformation Corps, a program that would pair successful veteran entrepreneurs with struggling communities across America, creating economic opportunity while building bridges between military and civilian culture. Senator Rebecca Walsh of Connecticut, the ranking Democrat on the Veterans Affairs Committee, stood to speak in support. Senator Rodriguez, your legislation represents exactly the kind of forward-thinking approach we need. But I have to ask, how do we ensure bipartisan support for such an ambitious program? Elena's answer surprised everyone in the chamber. Senator Walsh, I'd like to invite my Republican colleagues to not just support this legislation, but to help lead it. Senator Morrison, would you consider serving as co-lead sponsor? The move was unprecedented. Freshman senators didn't typically invite senior members of the opposing party to co-lead their signature legislation. But Elena had learned from her business experience that the most effective transformations happened when former opponents became invested partners. Senator Morrison stood slowly, clearly moved by the gesture. Senator Rodriguez, it would be my honor to work with you on legislation that serves our veterans and our community. The symbolism was powerful. A young Democratic woman and an older Republican man, both veterans separated by generation and geography, but united by service and the belief that America could do better for its military family. Over the following weeks, something remarkable happened in the Senate. Elena's approach to collaboration began influencing other legislators. Her weekly transformation breakfasts brought together senators from both parties to discuss not just legislation, but the personal experiences that had shaped their political views. Senator Morrison, who had initially been skeptical of Elena's youth and rapid rise, became one of her strongest allies. "Elena doesn't just talk about bringing people together," he told reporters. "She actually does. She listens to why you oppose something, understands your concerns and finds ways to address them without abandoning her principle." The breakthrough came when Elena invited Senator Morrison to visit the Phoenix digital headquarters and see firsthand how veteran entrepreneurs were building businesses that employed thousands of Americans. Morrison, whose Alabama district had struggled with economic decline, was amazed by the innovation and job creation potential. "I came to New York thinking I was doing Elena a favor," Morrison later said. "I left knowing she was doing me." These veteran entrepreneurs aren't just creating businesses, they're creating hope. The American Transformation Act passed the Senate 70. The House passed it by an even larger margin, and President Harris signed it in a Rose Garden ceremony that featured Patricia Blackwell as a special guest. But Elena's influence extended beyond legislation. Her approach to politics, dignified, collaborative, focused on transformation rather than destruction, began attracting national attention. Political commentators started talking about the Rodriguez model of governance, where former enemies became partners and personal growth was valued alongside political victory. The most telling moment came 6 months later, when Senator Crawford, who had lost his seat to Elena, published an op-ed in the Washington Post titled, "What Elena Rodriguez Taught Me About Leadership." In the piece, Crawford wrote, "I spent 15 years in the Senate, viewing every disagreement as a battle to be won and every opponent as an enemy to be defeated. Senator Rodriguez showed me that the greatest victories come from turning opponents into partners, conflicts into collaborations, and divisions into opportunities for growth." Crawford revealed that he had quietly been working with Elena's staff on veteran employment initiatives, using his connections in the private sector to create job opportunities for former service members. "Elena Rodriguez didn't just defeat me politically," he wrote. "She transformed me personally, just as she's transforming the Senate itself." The article went viral with millions of shares across social media platforms. It became required reading in political science courses and business schools as an example of how grace and victory could create lasting positive change. As Elena read Crawford's op-ed in her Senate office, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a dismissed soldier at a country club to a transformational force in American politics, her story had become proof that individual dignity and excellence could change not just personal circumstances, but entire institutions. Her phone buzzed with a text from Patricia, saw Crawford's article. "You've done it again, turned an enemy into an ally. I'm so proud to call you family." Elena typed back, "Patricia, you taught me that transformation is always possible. I'm just paying it forward." Outside her office window, Elena could see the Capitol dome illuminated against the evening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that American politics could be about more than winning and losing, more than attack ads and partisan warfare. But tonight, Senator Elena Rodriguez reflected on the simple truth that had guided her entire career. The most important victories weren't won by defeating enemies, but by helping them discover their better self. The woman who had once been told to know her place was now helping an entire nation rediscover what was possible when people of good faith worked together toward common goals, and this was only the beginning. The emergency session of Congress was called for 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that would test everything Elena Rodriguez had built over the past decade. A coordinated cyber attack on America's financial infrastructure had crippled banking systems across 12 states, and early intelligence suggested the assault was far more sophisticated than anything the nation had faced before. Elena sat in the secure briefing room beneath the Capitol, surrounded by the Senate's leadership and key committee chair. The Director of National Intelligence was explaining the scope of the attack when Elena's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Phoenix Digital's emergency response team. "Attack signature matches patterns we've been tracking. We can help." Senate Majority Leader Robert Harrison looked exhausted as he addressed the room. "We're looking at potential economic damage in the hundreds of billions. The president is considering emergency financial market closures, but that could trigger a panic that makes the damage even worse." Elena had remained quiet during the briefing, but now she spoke with the calm authority that had become her trademark. Leader Harrison, I believe there's a third option. Phoenix Digital's cybersecurity division has been tracking the attack vectors used in this assault. We may be able to not just stop the attack but trace it back to its source. Senator Morrison, now one of Elena's closest allies despite their party differences, leaned forward. Elena, are you saying your company can solve this? I'm saying we can, but it would require something unprecedented. Full cooperation between government agencies, private sector cybersecurity firms, and the banking industry. It would require trust, speed, and the kind of collaboration that Washington isn't known for. The room was silent as the implications sank in. Elena wasn't just offering a technical solution, she was proposing to demonstrate whether her model of transformational leadership could work during the nation's greatest crisis. What would you need? Asked Senator Walsh, the ranking Democrat on the Financial Services Committee. Elena had been preparing for this kind of moment her entire career. Congressional authorization for emergency public-private cybersecurity collaboration, direct access to the Federal Reserve's crisis management team, and the ability to coordinate with international allies whose banking systems have also been targeted. Leader Harrison looked skeptical. Senator Rodriguez, that level of coordination, we're talking about cutting through bureaucratic barriers that have existed for decades. Exactly, Elena replied. And if we can't do it during a national crisis, when can we? What happened next would be studied in crisis management courses for generations. Elena's emergency authorization passed Senate 94-6 in just 4 hours, the fastest major legislation in modern history. The House passed it by voice vote an hour later. By 3 p.m., President Harris had signed the Emergency Cybersecurity Coordination Act into law, but the real test was yet to come. Elena established a crisis command center in Phoenix Digital's Washington office, bringing together technical experts from government agencies, private companies, and allied nations. The team included former adversaries who had learned to trust Elena's leadership, including William Crawford, who now served as a cybersecurity consultant. Elena, Crawford said, as they reviewed the attack patterns, I have to admit, 6 months ago I would have said this kind of cooperation was impossible. Too many egos, too many competing interests. Elena smiled as she coordinated with teams in London, Tokyo, and Frankfurt. Bill, that's exactly why it works. When people think something is impossible, they stop fighting over who gets credit and start focusing on solving the problem. The breakthrough came at 11 p.m., when Elena's team identified the attack's command structure, hidden within apparently legitimate financial transactions. But stopping it would require simultaneous action across 4 continents, coordinated to the second. We get one shot at this, Elena told the assembled team via secure video conference. If we miss, they'll adapt their methods and we may never get another chance. The operation began at midnight Eastern Time. Elena coordinated from Washington while teams in 16 countries executed the most complex cybersecurity operation in history. Patricia Blackwell, now 76, sat in the command center at Elena's invitation. A reminder that transformation was possible even in the darkest moment. For 3 hours, the battle raged in cyberspace. Banking systems flickered between security and vulnerability, as Elena's teams fought to corner and neutralize the attackers. At 3:17 a.m., the last command server went dark. The financial markets opened on schedule. The attack had been stopped, the perpetrators identified, and the global banking system emerged stronger than before. But more importantly, Elena had proven that her model of collaborative leadership could work even under the ultimate pressure. The international media called it the Rodriguez Doctrine in action, the idea that former enemies could become partners, that collaboration could triumph over competition, and that the greatest victories came from building bridges rather than walls. President Harris called Elena to the Oval Office the following week. Senator Rodriguez, I'm impressed not just by your technical expertise, but by your ability to get people to work together who have been at each other's throats for years. Elena sat across from the president, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Madam President, I learned something important from a woman who once hated everything I represented. She taught me that people can change, that redemption is always possible, and that our greatest strength comes from helping others discover their better selves. The president leaned forward with interest. Senator, I'm going to be direct. The country needs the kind of leadership you've demonstrated. I want you to consider joining my administration as National Security Advisor. Elena was quiet for a long moment. The position would give her influence over America's security policy and the ability to implement her collaborative approach on a global scale. But it would also mean stepping back from the Senate, where she was building something unprecedented. Madam President, I'm honored by your confidence, but I believe my work in the Senate isn't finished. The transformation we've started, turning adversaries into allies, creating genuine bipartisan cooperation, that's the foundation for everything else we want to accomplish. The president smiled. I hoped you'd say that. But Elena, I want you to know that when you're ready to serve at the highest levels, the opportunity will be there. As Elena left the White House, she thought about 8-year-old Elena Patricia, who was growing up in a world where her aunt's model of leadership was becoming the norm, rather than the exception. The little girl who bore her name would never know a time when former enemies couldn't become friends, when political opponents couldn't find common ground, when transformation wasn't considered possible. That evening, Elena called Patricia to share the president's offer and her decision to decline. Elena, Patricia said, her voice warm with pride, you've taught me that the most important question isn't whether you can reach the top, but whether you can lift others up with you. You're doing something more valuable than climbing the political ladder. You're changing how the game is played. Elena looked out at the Capitol dome, illuminated against the night sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that American leadership could be about more than power and politics. It could be about transformation, redemption, and the radical belief that everyone deserved a chance to become their better self. The woman who had once been dismissed as unemployable was now turning down one of the most powerful positions in government to continue building something even more valuable, a new model of leadership that could heal a divided nation. Some leaders seek power. The greatest leaders seek to empower others. Elena Rodriguez had chosen her path, and it was leading towards something even more extraordinary than anyone could have imagined. 10 years after that fateful afternoon at Pinehurst Country Club, Elena Rodriguez stood before the largest gathering in the history of the United States Military Academy at West Point. As the commencement speaker for the class of 2035, she looked out at 1,200 young officers who would lead America into the second half of the 21st century, and among them, in the front row, sat Cadet Elena Patricia Blackwell Rodriguez. At 18, Elena's niece had grown into everything her aunt could have hoped for: brilliant, compassionate, and driven by the same unshakable belief that service to others was the highest calling. But more than that, she represented something unprecedented: the first generation to grow up in an America where Elena's model of transformational leadership had become the norm. Cadets of the class of 2035, Elena began, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd that included presidents, generals, and dignitaries from around the world. 10 years ago, someone told me I needed to know my place. Today I want to talk to you about what I learned when I discovered that my place, our place, is wherever character, service, and the courage to transform enemies into allies can make a difference. In the VIP section, Patricia Blackwell sat at age 83, now recognized as one of America's most influential philanthropists and veteran advocates. Beside her sat Maria, whose own journey from intimidated military spouse to respected business leader had inspired millions. Between them was 10-year-old Michael Robert, eagerly listening to the aunt who had taught his entire family that redemption was always possible. I want to tell you about a woman named Patricia Blackwell, Elena continued, gesturing toward the woman who had once been her greatest critic. 15 years ago, Mrs. Blackwell believed that military families were inferior, that soldiers were unemployable charity cases, that service to our country was essentially welfare fraud. Patricia stood slowly, acknowledging the recognition with the same dignity she had shown throughout her remarkable transformation. Blackwell has raised $2.3 billion for veteran causes, and has personally mentored 1847 military spouses in starting their own businesses. But the numbers, impressive as they are, don't tell you the most important part of Mrs. Blackwell's journey. The most important part is what she taught me about the true nature of victory. Elena paused, looking directly at her niece in the front row. Miss Blackwell taught me that the greatest victories aren't won by defeating enemies, they're won by helping enemies discover their capacity for good. She taught me that real strength isn't about proving you're better than someone else, it's about helping someone else become better than they thought possible. The cadets were completely silent now, understanding that they were hearing more than a commencement speech. They were witnessing the crystallization of a philosophy that had already begun reshaping American leadership. 15 years ago, I was a soldier who had been underestimated, dismissed, and humiliated. I had two choices: I could respond with anger and revenge, or I could respond with dignity and the patient work of transformation. Elena's voice grew stronger, carrying the authority of someone who had proven these principles at every level of American society. I chose transformation. It led to the transformation of the Department of Veterans Affairs, where veteran suicide rates fell by 67% and unemployment dropped to historic lows. It led to the United States Senate, where the American Transformation Act has created opportunities for 2.3 million veterans and their families. She gestured toward the assembled dignitaries, many of whom had once been her political opponents, but were now her collaborative partners. But most importantly, it led to the discovery that America's greatest strength isn't our military might or our economic power, it's our capacity for redemption, our belief in second chances, and our commitment to the idea that every person has untapped potential waiting to be discovered. Elena looked at her niece, seeing in the young woman's eyes the same determination that had carried her through combat zones and corporate boardrooms. Cadet Blackwell Rodriguez, would you please stand? Elena Patricia rose, her bearing already showing the confidence and dignity that ran in her family. Ladies and gentlemen, this young woman represents something extraordinary. She's growing up in an America where former enemies become closest allies, where political opponents work together to solve problems, where military service is honored not just with words but with action. Elena's voice became deeply personal, speaking to her niece, but addressing all the cadets. When you were born, Elena Patricia, your grandmother, Patricia, insisted you carry her name alongside mine. She said it was penance and pride combined, penance for her past prejudices, and pride in the transformation that was possible when people chose growth over grudges. The young cadet had tears in her eyes now, understanding the full weight of the legacy she carried. But I want you to understand something even more important, Elena continued. You don't carry the burden of our mistakes, you carry the promise of our possibility. You represent a generation that can take the lessons we learned through pain and apply them through wisdom. Elena turned back to address the entire graduating class. Cadets, you will face moments when everything you believe about fairness, justice, and human dignity will be tested. You will encounter people who underestimate you, dismiss you, or actively work against you. In those moments, you will have a choice. The silence was absolute. 1,200 future officers hanging on every word. You can choose to prove them wrong through excellence. You can choose to respond to hatred with dignity. You can choose to turn opposition into opportunity, enemies into allies, and setbacks into comebacks. Elena's voice rose with the passion that had driven her entire career. But most importantly, you can choose to remember that your ultimate victory isn't measured by how many people you defeat. It's measured by how many people you help discover their own capacity for greatness. The standing ovation began with the cadets, but quickly spread through the entire assembly. Presidents and generals, diplomats and business leaders, all rose to honor not just Elena's words, but the living example she had provided for an entire generation. As the applause continued, Elena looked out at the faces before her young officers, who would carry her philosophy of transformational leadership to every corner of the globe, who would prove that America's greatest export wasn't military hardware, but the radical idea that redemption was always possible. After the ceremony, as families gathered for celebrations across the West Point campus, Elena found herself in a quiet moment with Patricia and her niece. Aunt Elena, the young cadet said, I want you to know that everything I've accomplished I owe to watching you turn Miss Blackwell from an enemy into the grandmother who loves me unconditionally. Patricia, now frail but still sharp, took Elena's hand. My dear, when I was dying last month, yes, I know the doctors told you, I realized something. My legacy isn't the foundation, or the money or the award. My legacy is proving that even the most prejudiced heart can be transformed by patience and love. Elena felt tears welling up. Patricia had been fighting cancer for 6 months, but had insisted on attending the West Point ceremony despite her doctor's concern. Elena, Patricia continued, I want you to promise me something. When people remember my story, I want them to remember that the woman who was wrong about everything became right about the things that matter. I want them to know that no one is beyond redemption, no heart is too hardened to change, and no enemy is too entrenched to become an ally. 3 months later, Patricia Blackwell passed away peacefully, surrounded by the family she had once rejected but who had become her greatest source of pride. Her funeral was attended by thousands of veterans, business leaders and political figures from both parties, but the eulogy that mattered most was delivered by Elena Patricia Blackwell Rodriguez, who spoke about growing up with 2 grandmothers, one who had given her life, and one who had learned to give her love. At the funeral, former Senator William Crawford served as a pallbearer alongside other men and women whose lives had been transformed by Patricia's journey from prejudice to advocacy. The woman who had once dismissed military families was buried with full military honors, her casket draped with the American flag she had learned to truly understand. Today, the Rodriguez Center for Transformational Leadership at West Point trains military officers in the principles Elena pioneered, that true strength comes from building bridges, not walls, that victory is measured by lives transformed, not enemies defeated, and that the greatest leaders are those who help others discover their own capacity for greatness. Elena Rodriguez, veteran, entrepreneur, cabinet secretary, senator and teacher, had proven that a single person, responding to injustice with dignity rather than destruction, could change not just their own life, but the trajectory of an entire nation. The woman who had once been told to know her place, had taught America that everyone's place is wherever they can serve others, lift up the fallen, and prove that transformation is always possible. Some stories end with victory, the greatest stories end with redemption. And some people don't just change the world, they teach the world how to change itself. The moral: in a world that often rewards revenge and celebrates destruction, the greatest victories come from those who choose patience over punishment, transformation over retaliation, and the revolutionary belief that every human being, no matter how wrong, how hostile, or how hopeless they may seem, carries within them the capacity to become better than they ever imagined possible. True strength isn't about proving you're better than your enemy. True strength is about helping your enemies discover they're better than they thought they were. That is the lesson of Elena Rodriguez, that is the legacy of Patricia Blackwell, and that is the promise of an America that chooses redemption over revenge every single time.
You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.